Yorktown Memorial Hospital stands on the edge of a quiet Texas town, a red brick carcass surrounded by brittle grass and chain-link fencing. I used to pass it every week when I worked for a medical supply company out of San Antonio. The first time I saw it, I didn't know what it was. Just a long, low building with boarded windows and a crucifix still fixed above the main entrance. On the drive home one evening, I mentioned it to my coworker, Miguel. He laughed and told me that place had been abandoned for decades, that people used to sneak in for ghost hunts until the city started locking the gates. He said the locals still heard gurney wheels moving at night, and sometimes a faint hymn drifting from inside. That sort of story doesn't stick with most people, but it stuck with me. I'd grown up in small Texas towns where old churches and forgotten hospitals carried their own kinds of ghosts. I told myself I wasn't superstitious, but I was curious, and curiosity has a way of finding excuses. When Miguel took a week off, I used one of my solo delivery routes as a reason to swing by Yorktown late one Friday. It was near sunset when I pulled over across the street. The hospital looked smaller up close, more human in its decay. The front steps had cracked, and the wooden doors were chained shut with a city notice stapled crookedly to one side. Through a broken upper window, I could see a long corridor filled with shadows. I stood there a while, the truck engine ticking as it cooled, listening. There were cicadas in the trees, the slow hum of them pressing against the fading light, and beneath that hum, I could almost swear I heard a faint squeak. The sound came in intervals, soft and deliberate, like a wheel that needed oil. I walked closer until my boots were in the dirt just beyond the fence. When I stopped, the squeak stopped too. The air smelled strange, not like rot exactly, but sterile, as if the building was still clinging to its old habits. I told myself it was just the wind moving debris and headed back to the truck, but when I looked at the windshield, there was a handprint on the glass, pale with dust. I wiped it with my sleeve and drove off without looking back. That night I dreamed of narrow hallways lit by flickering bulbs. I dreamed of a woman in white standing beside a gurney, her hands clasped as if in prayer, but her face was hidden behind a surgical mask. I woke to my own heartbeat, convinced I'd just been too close to something that didn't want to be remembered. A week later, I was assigned a delivery to a clinic near Yorktown again. The route put me back on that same road around twilight. I slowed down when I reached the hospital, telling myself I just wanted another look in daylight to see how ordinary it really was. The front gates were still chained, but the fence on the east side had a loose panel. It looked like someone had pried it open recently. The wind carried the smell of dust and dry weeds. I parked in the lot and got out, my footsteps crunching over gravel. The world felt muted the way it does before a storm, even though the sky was clear. I ducked through the opening and crossed the courtyard. The main door was blocked, so I circled around and found a side entrance where part of the wall had collapsed. Inside, it was cool and still. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, landing on peeling green paint and a line of rusted wheelchairs leaning against the wall like waiting patients. The floor was littered with paper, old forms, and medical charts damp from years of leaks. The faint smell of antiseptic was stronger than I expected, sharp and dry. It shouldn't have been possible after all that time. I told myself it was mold or dust that carried the scent, but as I moved deeper, the air began to feel oddly clean, like the kind of cold you find in operating rooms. There was graffiti everywhere, names, dates, crude symbols, but one message stood out. It was scrawled across a door at the end of the hall in faded black marker, "Do not open after dark." I aimed my light at it, reading the words twice. The door itself was a heavy fire door, half cracked open. Beyond it, I could see another hallway leading to what must have been the surgical wing. I pushed the door gently. It swung inward with a groan. The smell of disinfectant rushed out, unmistakable now, and for the first time I thought I heard whispering. It wasn't distinct words, more like the soft shuffle of voices moving just beyond understanding. My light trembled on the tiles, catching a gurney half covered with a yellowed sheet. The wheels were rusted, but one of them gave a slow creak as the metal shifted under the beam. I should have turned back then, but there's something about fear that can twist into fascination. I stepped closer and lifted the sheet. There was nothing beneath it but an old mattress and a leather strap still buckled tight. I laughed under my breath, the sound too loud in that dead air. The whispering stopped. Somewhere deeper in the wing, a door slammed. The echo ran down the hallway like a body hitting the floor. My heart kicked hard. I swung the flashlight toward the sound and caught a flash of movement, a shadow slipping into a side room. I called out, asking if anyone was there. my voice cracking halfway through. No answer. The beam of my light flickered once, then steadied. I forced myself forward, passing faded signs for radiology and maternity. Every doorway looked the same, hollow and waiting. When I reached the room where I'd seen movement, I hesitated. The door was half open, and inside was an old metal bed with its frame bent. Against the far wall hung a crucifix tilted to one side. Something dark streaked the floor beneath it. I told myself it was rust, though it looked too much like something else. Then I saw the handprint on the wall. It was small, as if made by a child, smeared high near the light switch. Fresh dust had gathered everywhere except where the print was. I stepped closer, my breath shallow and the air grew colder. The flashlight dimmed for a second time, and in that brief darkness I heard it again, the squeak of gurney wheels, this time right behind me. I turned fast, shining the beam down the hall. Nothing. Only the empty corridor stretching toward the entrance. I wanted to run, but something about leaving without seeing what was moving made it worse. I listened. The sound came again, closer now, echoing in rhythm with the faint click of metal. I aimed the light toward the main hall. The gurney was moving. It rolled slowly out from a side corridor, its rusted wheels grinding softly. No one pushed it. It moved until it hit the far wall and stopped, the metal frame shuddering once. My throat went dry. Then the whispers started again, louder now, the air full of low, overlapping prayers, the kind of prayers spoken for the dying. I backed away, keeping the light steady until I reached the stairwell. I turned and ran, the beam bouncing off walls, catching the flash of broken tiles and old signage as I fled. I didn't stop until I burst through the side entrance and into the night air. The sun had vanished completely. I scrambled through the fence, caught my jacket on the wire, tore it free, and didn't stop running until I reached the truck. When I looked back, the hospital windows glowed faintly, not with light, but with the reflection of something moving inside. A shadow crossed one of the upper panes, slow and deliberate, and then the glow faded. I drove back to San Antonio that night with the windows down, trying to shake the smell of antiseptic that clung to my clothes. I didn't tell Miguel what I'd done, but when he came back to work, he asked why my voice sounded hoarse. I told him I'd caught a cold. 2 weeks later, a story hit the local paper about vandals breaking into Yorktown Memorial. The police found the place undisturbed except for a single gurney left blocking the main entrance doors, as if someone had pushed it there from the inside. They mentioned fresh fingerprints on the frame but didn't release details. I tried not to think about it, but every time I heard a squeak, at work, in a hallway, in a supermarket cart, it set something cold moving in my chest. I quit the supply job not long after. I told people I was tired of the hours of all that driving, but the truth was simpler. I still dream about that corridor sometimes. The walls shine white and the air smells clean. Somewhere ahead I hear the wheels begin to roll, followed by the low murmur of prayer, and no matter how fast I move toward the exit, the door never opens. In the center of Mineral Well stands a building that doesn't quite seem to exist in the same decade as everything around it. The Baker Hotel rises like an exhausted monarch, its red bricks dulled by time, its arched windows blind and heavy with dust. I'd passed it dozens of times on my way through town, but last winter I decided to stop. The plan was simple: spend one night inside, record everything, and maybe get a few photos for my local history blog. I didn't believe in ghosts, not really. I believed in places holding memory, in walls remembering laughter or fear. But belief doesn't prepare you for what the air feels like in there. The lobby was a cathedral of silence. My flashlight beam caught flakes of plaster floating like snow. Once this was a spa for the rich, a retreat where oil barons and Hollywood stars soaked their bones in mineral water, said to heal everything from heartbreak to arthritis. Now all that remained were echoes. I could still smell faint lavender perfume near the grand staircase, though I hadn't sprayed anything. I convinced myself it was just mold, the kind that smells floral when it rots. I set up my small camp near the ballroom because that was the heart of every story I'd read about the hotel. Locals claimed you could still hear music playing there at night, and sometimes, if you were unlucky, see a woman in a pale dress twirling by herself beneath a chandelier that no longer hung. I laughed it off while unpacking my gear. The ballroom was massive, its polished floor warped and cracked, moonlight spilling through broken windows onto faded murals of dancers. The silence had texture, thick, almost oily, Every movement I made felt too loud, like I was disturbing a long-forgotten service. Around 9 p.m., the wind picked up outside. The doors rattled softly. I heard the elevator cables groan in the shaft, even though there hadn't been power here in decades. I walked the upper floors with my recorder running, narrating details. Room 405 smelled like burnt sugar. Room 703's door had been sealed with a rusted chain. When I reached the suite rumored to have belonged to the lady in lavender, my batteries died all at once. Not drained, dead. The flashlight flickered and I found myself in darkness so thick it pressed against my skin. I don't remember deciding to leave that floor. Only the sound of my boots hitting the marble again when I reached the lobby. Back in the ballroom, I tried to rationalize what I'd experienced. Old wiring, temperature shifts, carbon monoxide, any excuse that made it science instead of something else. I sat in a broken chair facing the center of the room, sipping coffee from my thermos when I heard the faintest hum of music. It wasn't from my phone. I turned it off to preserve the charge. It was coming from above, distant but unmistakable, the slow rhythm of a waltz. The same 3 notes looping softly, like a record warped by heat. I lifted the camera, the little red light blinking to life, and the sound cut out. I waited, frozen, until the silence became unbearable. Then it returned, louder, closer, joined by the faint rustle of fabric. My mouth went dry. I told myself again and again that it was the wind until I smelled that lavender perfume. Not faint anymore. Fresh, deliberate, like someone standing right beside me. The ballroom wasn't empty. At first I thought my eyes were playing tricks in the half-light, but there was movement near the center of the room. A shimmer like heat rising off asphalt. Then the outline of a woman, blurred but human-shaped, her head tilted as if listening to the music. Her dress swayed slightly, though the air was still. I couldn't see her face, only that her hair was pinned high, and her posture was that of someone who'd been waiting too long for a partner who never arrived. She turned, slow and graceful, and the music grew clear enough for me to recognize the melody. Blue Moon, played faintly off-key. When she stepped toward me, the air around my neck turned icy. Every instinct told me not to move, not to make a sound. The camera's viewfinder showed nothing but static. I blinked and she was suddenly closer. 10 feet away now. I could hear fabric dragging across the warped floorboards. Then she smiled. Or maybe that's what my brain decided it saw. And the entire room seemed to pulse once, like the building took a breath. I ran, I didn't think, just moved. My boots echoed down the hallway, through the lobby, out the front doors that resisted until the last possible second, as though the building itself hated letting anyone go. I didn't stop until I reached my car. The engine refused to start for nearly a minute, then roared to life. I drove to the edge of town before pulling over to breathe. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely light a cigarette. When I looked at the hotel from the hilltop, every window on the upper floor glowed faintly golden for just a moment, like a grand party was still going on inside. I went home that night certain I'd imagined everything, that adrenaline and exhaustion had blurred the line between sound and thought. But when I transferred the footage the next morning, I noticed something impossible. The camera had indeed captured no visuals of the ballroom, just static, but the audio track told a different story. The waltz was there, faint and warbling, and then clear as a whisper next to the microphone, a woman's voice said, "Would you like to dance?" I deleted the file immediately, but that didn't stop her. For weeks afterward, I woke around 3 a.m. to that same melody playing somewhere in my apartment. My phone would vibrate across the nightstand with notifications from a number that wasn't saved, just blank, no digits. Each message contained the same 3 words, "Check in again." I changed my number, moved apartments, stopped writing altogether. Still, every now and then I catch that lavender scent when I pass a certain place or hear a note of that waltz drifting through static when I turn on the radio. I've thought about going back, maybe finishing the story properly. But something tells me that if I do, I won't leave this time. Some guests, as the locals say, never check out of the Baker Hotel. And I think she's still waiting, turning slow circles in the dark, saving the last dance for me. There's something about the bridge that feels wrong even in daylight. I'd driven past it 100 times when I lived in Denton County. But it wasn't until that October night that I ever dared to stop. Old Alton Bridge, they call it. Locals whisper Goatman's Bridge like a curse. The rusted trusses stretch over Hickory Creek, A skeletal frame that seems to hum with some old, buried energy. They say the air tastes like iron here. I thought that was just a poetic exaggeration, until I stepped out of my car and the metallic tang hit the back of my throat like a mouthful of blood. I wasn't alone. My friend Lucas had talked me into it. He was a photographer who thrived on places like this, abandoned, haunted, forgotten. He said he wanted to capture the texture of fear. I laughed when he said it, but I noticed his hand shake when he lit a cigarette. His girlfriend Amy came too, though she didn't want to. She kept saying the bridge gave her headaches. There was one other with us, a guy named Tyler who'd grown up in Corinth. He was the one who told us the story. In the late 1800s, a black goat farmer named Oscar Washburn lived near the creek. Folks said his herd was the best in North Texas. He was kind, honest, respected by both white and black neighbors for miles. Until he put up a sign at the bridge that read, "This way to the Goatman." One night, a group of men rode out to his cabin, dragged him from his home and hanged him from the bridge. When they looked down, the noose was empty. His body was never found. The next morning, the families of the men who killed him began to disappear, one by one. People say if you cross the bridge at midnight and call out his name, you'll hear hooves behind you, but not touching the planks. Floating. That night was cold and damp. Mist clung to the road like wet silk. The woods on either side of the bridge were thick with oak and mesquite, their branches twisted into shapes that looked almost human in the headlights. We parked a few yards from the bridge and turned off the engine. The silence was total except for the ticking of the cooling metal. Then, faintly, I heard the creek gurgling below, slow and heavy as if reluctant to move. Lucas unpacked his tripod and camera. Amy refused to leave the car, so she sat in the back seat with her phone flashlight trembling in her hand. Tyler and I followed Lucas to the bridge. The planks creaked under our boots, each one groaning like an old floorboard in a dying house. The smell of rust and something else, something foul and sweet like rotting fruit, hung in the air. We reached the middle of the bridge. The railings were scarred with graffiti. "Goatman lives. Stay away. He's watching." I leaned against the iron beam and looked down. The creek reflected the moonlight like dark glass. For a second, I thought I saw something move beneath the surface, but it was just the current twisting around a fallen branch. Lucas set up his camera and said, "We'll take a long exposure. Maybe we'll get something." He grinned, but his voice was tight. Tyler smirked. "You want to summon him?" he asked. "Let's do it the old way." Before I could stop him, he shouted into the darkness, "Goatman, I'm not afraid of you." His voice echoed off the trees, fading into the night. The silence that followed was thicker than before, like the world had taken a breath and forgotten to let it out. Then we heard it, a soft sound, almost delicate, clop, clop, clop. It came from somewhere behind us, slow and measured, but the boards under our feet didn't move. Lucas's camera snapped off a shot by itself, the flash slicing through the mist. The light caught the trees at the far end of the bridge, and for a fraction of a second I saw a shape standing there. Tall, impossibly tall, its head sloped forward. The flash faded and the darkness rushed back in. Tyler cursed under his breath. "Probably a deer," he said, but his voice trembled. We turned back toward the car, walking faster now. The sound followed us. Hooves, faint but steady, like someone walking just out of sight. The air felt thick, the iron taste stronger, almost metallic enough to sting. I tried to convince myself it was just nerves, but then Amy screamed. We sprinted the last few feet. Amy was out of the car, pointing at the trees. Her phone flashlight was shaking so badly that the beam jittered across the ground. "Something was moving out there," she said, her voice cracking. I saw eyes. Red eyes. Lucas checked his camera screen. The picture he'd taken showed the bridge under the flash's glare, the trusses glinting like bones. But near the far end, half hidden in the fog, was a figure. It wasn't human. Its legs bent backward, its upper body broad and hunched, and where a head should have been, there was something like a skull. Two long, curved horns caught the light. Tyler grabbed the camera. "It's just a trick of the flash," he muttered, but he was backing away. "Lens flare or something." Lucas shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "Look at the shadow." The figure's shadow stretched toward us, though the light had come from our direction. Something splashed in the creek below. Then the sound of hooves started again, closer now, echoing off the water and wood. I felt the boards vibrate under my boots, but when I looked down, they weren't moving. The sound wasn't coming from the bridge, it was inside it, like it was traveling through the metal beams themselves. Amy was crying, begging us to leave. We piled into the car, Lucas clutching his camera like it was the only thing keeping him anchored to reality. The engine sputtered, then caught. As we pulled away, I looked in the rearview mirror. Through the fog, I saw a shape standing on the bridge, watching us go. Its eyes glowed faintly, and I swear I saw its jaw move like it was whispering something. We didn't stop until we were back in town. None of us said much on the drive. Amy kept her head down. Tyler stared out the window, pale and sweating. Lucas was silent, the camera on his lap. The next morning I called him. No answer. Later that day, Tyler texted me. He said Lucas had been found at the edge of the creek near the bridge, his car door open, the camera smashed in the mud. The sheriff's report said he'd drowned, though the water there is barely waist deep. They said his body was found tangled in barbed wire, his skin torn but no sign of a struggle. His mouth was full of blood and something else, goat hair. I didn't go to the funeral. Amy moved away a week later. Tyler stopped returning my calls. I drove past the bridge once more before I left Denton for good. The county had blocked it off by then, the rusted trusses sealed behind chain-link fencing. But even through the metal, I could see something written fresh on the steel beam, in what looked like dried mud. Still here. I swear I could hear hooves when I turned the engine off. Not on the road, not in the trees, just behind me, faint and deliberate, the rhythm slow and steady. I didn't look back. I drove until the bridge was miles behind me. But even now, when I close my eyes, I can taste iron on my tongue. The Driscoll Hotel has stood on the corner of 6th and Brazos in downtown Austin since 1886. Its Romanesque arches and limestone facade gleaming under the Texas sun by day and looming like a memory by night. I checked in on a Tuesday in late October, the kind of day when the air carries a faint chill that makes the city's neon lights seem sharper, cleaner. The lobby smelled faintly of polished wood, bourbon, and something else I couldn't name. Something old. The clerk smiled too long when I mentioned I'd booked the same room President Johnson once used during his campaign years. She didn't correct me, but her eyes drifted briefly toward the grand staircase as if listening for something. The Driscoll feels like stepping into a different time. Every wall breathes history. Oil paintings of long-dead ranchers hang crookedly, and the chandeliers hum faintly with the sound of old wiring. The elevator creaked like an old man clearing his throat. My room, 525, faced 6th Street, and from my window I could see the ghostly blur of headlights moving through the Austin night. The bed was king-sized, the air faintly cool, and there was a smell of cigar smoke that grew stronger whenever I stood near the bathroom door. I assumed the last guest had been careless, maybe someone sneaking a puff despite the no-smoking policy. But when I cracked the window to let in fresh air, the smell didn't fade. It seemed to grow thicker, as though someone were standing right behind me with a lit cigar, breathing quietly. The first night passed without much incident. I remember hearing the piano from the lobby drift up around midnight, soft notes that reminded me of rain on glass. When I went down to see who was playing, the lobby was empty. The piano lid was closed, and the only sound came from the slow tick of the grandfather clock near the front desk. I told myself the sound must have come from a nearby bar. This was Austin after all. Music lived in its walls. The second night was different. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. Slow, deliberate, like someone pacing. I got up, peered through the peephole, and saw nothing but the ornate wallpaper across the corridor. Then came the knock. 3 short taps, precise and calm. I opened the door immediately, expecting maybe a drunk guest who'd lost their way. The hallway was empty. I leaned out, looked both ways, and saw the light flicker near the far end by the stairwell. I was about to close the door when I felt it, a light touch on the back of my neck, like fingers trailing cold air. I spun around. No one was there, but the smell of cigar smoke hung heavy again. Sleep didn't come easy after that. I left the TV on low volume, more for company than noise. Around 3:15, I heard faint laughter. It wasn't from the TV. It was a woman's laugh, soft but broken, echoing faintly as if coming from a far-off ballroom. I muted the screen, straining to hear it again. The laugh turned into sobbing. I followed the sound into the hall, barefoot on the old carpet, heart pounding. It led me toward the grand staircase. The same one where they say a young bride hanged herself after being left at the altar in 1930. The air felt heavier there, colder, as though the temperature dropped 10 degrees in an instant. And then I saw her. For a moment I thought it was another guest. A woman stood halfway up the stairs, her head tilted slightly as though she were listening for a tune. She wore a faded wedding dress yellowed with age, her veil torn near the top. Her face was pale but not ghostly, too real, too human. I whispered something, I think it was, "Are you all right?" And she looked up. Her eyes were empty but wet, glimmering in the low light. Then she smiled. It was faint, tired, almost tender. Before I could move, she turned and walked upward into the darkness. Her steps made no sound. The staircase creaked once after she vanished. I ran back to my room, locked the door, and turned on every light. I must have stayed awake till dawn, sitting in the chair by the window, watching the skyline brighten over the city. When I finally stepped into the bathroom to wash my face, I noticed something written faintly in the fog on the mirror. At first I thought it was condensation patterns, but the letters were clear. Stay. My reflection looked back at me, pale and wide-eyed. The writing disappeared as quickly as it came, fading into the glass like a breath dissolving. I considered checking out that morning, but curiosity has a strange pull in places like the Driscoll. The staff, when asked, avoided direct answers. One housekeeper just said, "You're in the old wing. It keeps memories." She smiled when she said it, but her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her cart. That night I left a voice recorder running while I slept. I'd read about people doing that in haunted places, sometimes catching sounds they couldn't explain. When I played it back the next morning, most of it was static and my own restless breathing. But around 2:47 a.m. there was a voice, faint but clear enough to understand. A woman's whisper, "Don't leave me." Then a pause and the sound of something heavy dragging across the floor. I replayed it a dozen times, each time feeling my stomach twist tighter. The recorder sat on the nightstand. Nothing in the room had moved. On my last night, I decided to stay awake, determined to see whatever was there. Around midnight, the lights flickered once, then went out entirely. The backup generator must have failed because the whole hotel went dark. I lit the small flashlight I'd brought and stepped into the hallway. From somewhere down below came the faint rhythm of the piano again. The same song, slow and steady. I followed it, each step echoing louder than it should have. When I reached the lobby, the chandelier was swaying gently, though there was no breeze. The piano lid was open this time, and the keys pressed down by themselves, one after another, like invisible hands gliding over them. I felt frozen watching when a sudden warmth brushed my shoulder. It was the unmistakable pressure of a hand, resting lightly for a moment before it was gone. The cigar smell returned, thicker than ever. I turned toward the grand staircase and saw him then, a man standing in the shadows near the second-floor balcony. He wore an old-fashioned suit, his figure solid yet somehow indistinct, as if half fading into the dark. His head was bowed, and I could see the faint glow of a cigar ember near his mouth. When he looked up, his eyes caught the dim light. There was no malice there, just an overwhelming sadness, deep and endless. He raised the cigar, tipped it in my direction, and then, without sound, stepped backward into the wall and disappeared. The lights came back moments later. The chandelier stilled. The piano fell silent. Everything looked perfectly normal again. I left the Driscoll the next morning without breakfast, unable to shake the feeling that I hadn't just seen ghosts. I'd intruded on someone's endless, repeating sorrow. When I reached my car and turned back for one last look, I saw a figure standing in one of the upstairs windows, a woman in white, veil fluttering slightly even though the air was still. She didn't move, didn't wave. She just watched as I pulled away, the reflection of her pale outline vanishing as the sun rose over Austin. The desert around Marfa has a kind of quiet that can drive a man crazy. It's not just silence. It's an emptiness that swallows sound, stretches time, and makes every rustle of wind sound like it's whispering your name. I moved to Marfa, Texas in 2016, chasing peace after a divorce that left me hollowed out. I rented a small trailer just outside town, about 4 miles off Highway 67, where the desert opens wide toward the Chinati Mountains. From my porch, I could see nothing but scrub, stars, and the occasional train in the distance. But every few nights I'd see something else, strange, hovering lights dancing over the desert floor. The locals called them the Marfa Lights. Everyone had their own story about what they were. Ghosts, spirits of Apache warriors, headlights refracting through layers of hot air, or even something not of this world. I didn't buy any of it at first. I'd seen lights out there plenty of times, always low to the ground, usually yellow or white, sometimes red. They'd appear just after sunset and fade before midnight. Some moved fast, others hung in place. The weirdest thing was they never seemed to get closer, no matter how far you drove toward them. It was like they were always keeping their distance. My neighbor, Old Man Jeffers, swore he'd followed one all the way into the desert one night back in the 70s. He said it led him miles off the road before disappearing, and when he turned back, he couldn't find his truck for hours. He told me, "They don't want to be found, son. They just want you lost." He said it with that dry, cracked laugh of his, but I could tell there was truth behind it. You don't joke like that unless something scared you deep. For months, I watched the lights from my porch, sometimes with a beer in hand, sometimes just sitting there in the dark with my dog, Boone. Boone never liked the lights. Whenever they showed up, he'd growl low and steady, his hackles standing up. He'd sit stiff beside me, eyes locked on the horizon. One night, though, the lights looked different. There weren't just 2 or 3 this time. There were at least 7 of them, drifting in a slow, deliberate line across the desert like lanterns floating on water. They seemed closer than usual, bright enough to throw faint reflections off the metal siding of my trailer. Boone started barking, pacing in circles. I should have gone inside, but something about those lights felt magnetic. I couldn't look away. I decided that night I was going to see them up close. Not from the highway, not from my porch, up close. I packed a small backpack, flashlight, compass, canteen, and a little hand radio. I told myself it was just to prove they were headlights or campfires or something logical. But deep down I knew it wasn't logic pulling me out there. It was curiosity. The same kind that makes you stare into the dark even when you feel something staring back. Around 9 that night, I parked my truck off a dirt road near the viewing area tourists used. From there, the desert stretched out like a black ocean. The lights were already visible. 3 white, 1 red, hovering low and moving slowly to the east. The air was still and dry. I started walking, my boots crunching against the gravel. For a while, I kept my bearings by the mountains in the distance, but after 20 minutes, they faded into the night. It was just me, the wind, and those lights. They never stayed still. The closer I thought I was getting, the farther they seemed to drift. My compass needle started to twitch, and the radio I brought began picking up faint static that rose and fell like breathing. Boone's barking echoed in my head even though he wasn't there. I kept walking, driven by this stupid need to touch what shouldn't be touched. After an hour, I saw something ahead of me, a shape. Not one of the lights, but a silhouette. It looked like a man, standing completely still in the glow of one of the floating orbs. I froze, my light beam flicked across the sand and stopped at his feet. He was wearing old clothes, maybe from the 40s or 50s. Slacks, suspenders, a dusty white shirt. His face was turned toward me, though I couldn't make out his eyes. The light above him pulsed faintly, almost like it was breathing with him. I called out, asking if he was okay. He didn't move. Then he lifted one arm slowly and pointed behind me. I turned. There was nothing but desert and darkness. When I looked back, the man was gone, and so was the light. I panicked then. I ran, tripping over rocks, losing all sense of direction. The radio in my pack hissed louder, voices whispering fragments I couldn't make out. I tried to find the mountains, but the horizon was empty. That's when the lights appeared again, this time circling me. 6, maybe 7 of them drifting closer. They moved like they were alive, flickering in rhythm, forming patterns that made my head ache to look at. My flashlight dimmed and the air grew cold. I swear I heard footsteps crunching behind me, but every time I turned, the desert was empty. I stumbled for what felt like hours until I saw the faint outline of my truck. I sprinted toward it, hands shaking as I fumbled the keys. When the engine roared to life, I slammed the gas pedal and didn't look back until I was halfway to Alpine. The light stayed behind, fading into the distance. But I didn't feel relief, just confusion and dread, like I'd seen something I wasn't supposed to. For days I didn't sleep. I kept seeing the man in the suspenders every time I closed my eyes. Sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night and see a faint white glow out past my window. Boone would growl until it disappeared. A few nights later, I drove into town and told Jeffers what happened. He didn't laugh this time. He just nodded slowly and said, "You followed them. You're lucky you made it back. Not everyone does." He told me about a woman named Clara who vanished out there in 1993. Her car was found abandoned near the viewing area, Keys still in the ignition, doors unlocked. They searched for her for weeks but never found a body. Locals said the lights led her away, just like they tried to do to me. Some say she still wanders the desert glowing like one of them. I moved out of Marfa a month later, couldn't stand the sight of that horizon anymore. But even now, sometimes when I drive lonely Texas highways at night, I catch a glimpse of a light in the distance, low and steady, keeping pace with my truck. I tell myself it's nothing, just headlights or a reflection or heat-bending light. But sometimes when I slow down, that light slows too. And when I stop completely, it stops right beside me, hovering there like it's waiting for me to follow again. The first time I saw the Hotel Galvez, it was gleaming like a mirage against the Gulf, sunlight glancing off its pale stucco walls and red-tiled roof. I had come to Galveston chasing ghosts, though I wouldn't have said that aloud back then. I told myself I was researching for a book, something about the storm of 1900 and the lives it swallowed, but that wasn't entirely true. The truth was that I'd been dreaming of the place for weeks before I even booked the room. Dreams of a grand hotel standing against black water, the sound of children laughing somewhere deep inside the walls. The Galvez sits at the edge of the island, its foundation pressed into the very sand where thousands died when the hurricane tore through. Locals still say the beach there is cursed. The receptionist smiled when I checked in, but there was something tight about her expression when she saw my room assignment. "Fifth floor?" she asked, eyes flicking up from the screen. "You sure you don't want to stay lower?" I laughed it off, said I wanted a view of the ocean. She hesitated, then handed me the key card without another word. My room faced east. From the window I could see the surf breaking, the remnants of the old seawall and the long curve of the pier lights coming on as dusk settled. The air carried that mix of salt and rot you only get near the Gulf, heavy enough to taste. When the wind shifted, I could smell the marshes inland and the faint sweetness of the flowers that bloomed around the hotel gardens. It was peaceful, in a way that felt almost staged, as if the place was holding its breath. That night I took a walk through the corridors. The Galvez was beautiful in a tired kind of way. High ceilings, creaking floors, and chandeliers that hummed softly when the air conditioner kicked on. The halls were lined with old photographs, black and white shots of Galveston before and after the storm. I stopped at one near the stairwell. It showed children sitting on the beach building something with sand and sticks. Their faces were smudged, the kind of blur that comes from long exposure, but there was something about their eyes. They looked wrong, too sharp for the rest of the picture, as if they'd been added later. When I went back to my room, the door across the hall was cracked open. I thought I saw someone inside, a small figure standing near the window, but when I looked again, the room was dark. I figured another guest had left it ajar, though it bothered me enough that I mentioned it to the front desk later. The same receptionist just nodded. "Housekeeping handles that floor in the mornings," she said. "Best to keep your door locked at night." The next evening, the Gulf turned gray. Wind battered the windows and lightning flickered far out at sea. I'd been sitting at my desk, going through my notes about the 1900 storm. Over 6,000 people dead, maybe more. Families buried under sand, orphanages swept away, bodies found tangled in seaweed miles inland. One of the hotels near this very spot had collapsed under the surge, taking dozens of guests with it. As I read, the lights flickered just once, and I heard what sounded like children running in the hall. Quick, light footsteps followed by the unmistakable sound of giggling. When I opened the door, the corridor was empty. The carpet stretched away in both directions, thick and silent. I waited a minute, listening. Nothing. I told myself it was another guest's kids, but when I went to close the door, I noticed wet footprints on the carpet outside my room, small ones barefoot leading away toward the stairwell. The hallway was dry otherwise. That night I dreamed of water. Not the calm rolling surf outside, but black rising water that smashed against windows and burst through the doors. I was inside the hotel as it filled, watching pale shapes drift by in the murk. Somewhere in the dark I heard laughter, light and distant as if it came from below. When I woke, my pillow was damp. The air smelled of salt and mildew. By the third night, I was starting to believe the stories. Staff whispered about the playful spirits, children who had drowned during the storm and supposedly haunted the upper floors. Guests claimed to hear marbles rolling across the floor, doors opening on their own, the faint splash of water where none should be. I tried to record sounds in my room, Set my phone to capture audio overnight. The next morning, I found the recording full of static, except for one brief moment around 2:17 a.m., when a child's voice said clearly, "Come play." I went down to the front desk again, this time showing the recording. The man on duty was older, gray-haired and polite. He listened, then smiled sadly. "They like you," he said. "Some people never hear a thing. Others, well, they get invited." When I pressed him, he only shrugged. "This place was built on sorrow, sir. The walls remember." That night the laughter came again, louder, closer. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, and realized the sound wasn't coming from the hall, it was in the room. I switched on the lamp. Nothing. Just my suitcase in the corner and the faint shimmer of moonlight through the curtains. But when I looked down, the carpet near the foot of the bed was wet. Not damp, wet as if someone had stepped out of the ocean and stood there dripping. I could smell salt water, thick and sour, and then faintly a child's whisper. "We can't find her." I froze. The voice had come from near the bathroom. When I turned, the door was open just enough to see movement inside. A flicker of white, like a dress hem swaying. I stepped closer, and for a moment I saw them. 3 children, pale as mist, faces gray-blue, eyes wide and hollow. They stood ankle-deep in water that wasn't there, staring at me. Then the light blinked and they were gone. I didn't sleep after that. I sat by the window and watched the Gulf, restless under the moon. Around 4 in the morning, I saw something move on the beach. A small figure standing near the tide line looking up at the hotel. When lightning flashed, I saw it was a girl in an old-fashioned white dress, her hair plastered to her face. She raised one hand as if waving. Then she turned and walked straight into the water. I checked out the next morning. The receptionist didn't seem surprised. "It happens," she said quietly as she slid the receipt across the counter. "You'll think about them for a while. Most people do." On my way out of town, I stopped near the seawall and looked back. The Galvez loomed above the beach, proud and still, its windows glinting in the sun. For a second, I thought I saw faces behind one of the upper windows, small, indistinct, but watching. Weeks later, back home, I developed the photos I'd taken in Galveston. One of them showed the hotel at night, its windows glowing faintly. In the lower corner of the frame, barely visible, were the figures of 3 children standing in the surf. Their reflections rippled in the water, though the tide had been out when I took the shot. And even now, when I zoom in close, I can see the faintest trace of smiles on their faces. Smiles that don't belong to anything living. Sometimes late at night, I play that old recording again, the one from my room. Between the hiss of static and the crash of distant waves, I can still hear the voice. Not playful this time, but patient. "You'll come back," it says. "We'll be waiting." The old brick facade of La Carafe sat quietly under the yellow haze of a Houston street lamp, its weathered sign half hidden by creeping ivy that had taken hold over a century ago. The door, warped by time and Gulf humidity, gave a soft sigh when pushed open, as if exhaling memories of the countless souls who had walked through it. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of old wood, dust, and the faint lingering sweetness of spilled wine that had long since soaked into the bar top. It wasn't a place that tried to impress. It didn't need to. La Carafe was the oldest bar in the city, and it wore that age like a badge of honor. Candles flickered in wine bottles, dripping wax that hardened over layers of decades. The lighting was dim, and the uneven floors creaked underfoot like they had something to say but were too tired to finish the thought. I started working there the summer I turned 30, after losing my job at a printing shop downtown. The owner, a gray-haired man named Carl, hired me on the spot. He didn't ask much, just that I be on time and not drink on the clock. I thought it would be an easy gig, serving beer and wine to tourists curious about old Houston history. What I didn't know was that La Carafe wasn't just old. It was alive in a way I couldn't explain. The first time I noticed something strange, it was a quiet Tuesday night. Rain had just stopped, leaving the streets shiny and empty. Only 2 customers were left. A couple of artists talking in hushed tones at the corner table. I was wiping the bar when I heard a sharp click behind me. The old brass cash register, an antique Carl refused to replace, had popped open on its own. It wasn't plugged in and it didn't have an automatic drawer. I checked it, thinking maybe I'd leaned against it or something, but it was dead still. Inside the drawer, though, one of the bills was folded into a perfect triangle. I didn't mention it to Carl, but when I told one of the regulars, she laughed softly and said, "Guess they liked your service." She didn't explain who they were, and I didn't ask. A week later during closing, I heard the bottles rattle. It was subtle at first, like a tremor or passing truck, except the street outside was empty. The sound grew sharper, bottles clinking one after another in a slow, deliberate rhythm, like someone was running their finger across the tops of them. I froze, dish towel in hand, eyes locked on the shelves. The bottles trembled, stopped, and then settled as if nothing had happened. I stood there for what felt like minutes, waiting for an explanation that didn't come. The next morning, Carl told me not to worry. "It's just the old bones of the building," he said, lighting a cigarette in the doorway. "This place shifts when the humidity changes. You'll get used to it." But I never really did. By late August, I started noticing patterns. The bottles only rattled on nights when the air outside was completely still, when not even the trees across the street were moving. The register would open only when I was alone. And sometimes after midnight, the faint sound of piano keys would drift from the back room, a sound too soft to be music, too deliberate to be random. I found out later there used to be a piano there decades ago, before the city banned live music in the bar for safety reasons. It had been sold off to some antique collector in the 60s, but the music never left. One night, a thunderstorm rolled in quick, hammering against the windows as lightning split the sky over Buffalo Bayou. The crowd thinned out early, and by closing, it was just me and the rain. I was counting the till when the register popped open again. This time I swore under my breath and went to shut it, but before I could, I felt a chill sweep across the back of my neck. The air turned damp and cold, like a door to a cellar had been left open. My reflection in the glass behind the bar wavered, like something had brushed past me. That's when I saw the faint outline of a child's handprint on the mirror. Small, smudged, and fresh. Carl found me sitting outside an hour later, drenched and shaking. He didn't seem surprised. "They like to play tricks sometimes," he said quietly. "Kids mostly. From the flood." I didn't understand what he meant until he told me about 1900. The great storm that destroyed Galveston had sent survivors fleeing north, and some ended up here in Houston. Families, children, people who had nowhere else to go. One story said the bar had served as a refuge during those desperate weeks. Some made it through. Some didn't. After that, I started noticing more. Soft laughter near the stairs when no one was around. The faint smell of salt water and mud rising from the cellar even though we were miles from the coast. Glasses shifting slightly out of place when I turned my back. A whisper that sometimes said my name, drawn out like a sigh. The thing about La Carafe is that it doesn't try to scare you. It just reminds you in its own quiet way that it remembers everything. Every voice, every hand that's ever touched its walls. One evening, a group of tourists came in, loud and half-drunk, joking about ghosts. One of them, a tall guy in a baseball cap, decided to mock the bar. He tapped the register, called out, "Hey, ghost bartender, pour me a drink." The drawer slammed open so hard it knocked his beer off the counter. Everyone froze. The guy laughed nervously and backed away, his face pale under the candlelight. I didn't say a word, just kept wiping the counter like nothing had happened. They left soon after without finishing their drinks. It got worse in October. Maybe the air was changing again, or maybe the house was tired of being laughed at. One night near closing, I heard footsteps upstairs. The second floor had been closed to the public for years, used only for storage. The boards groaned under what sounded like deliberate, steady movement. I grabbed a flashlight and went up, even though every part of me told me not to. The hallway smelled faintly of wine and dust. Shelves of old bottles lined the walls, each one thick with grime and labels too faded to read. I followed the sound to the end of the hall where a small window overlooked the street. The glass was fogged from the inside, though the air was dry. As I stepped closer, I noticed something scratched faintly into the wood beneath the window. It looked like initials, AL, and beside them a small handprint carved deep enough to splinter. Then the bottles on the shelf behind me rattled all at once. Not like before, not a slow rhythm or faint vibration, but a sudden violent clatter. The flashlight flickered, and for a split second I saw movement in the reflection of the glass, a child's face pale and wet watching me from behind the shelf. When I turned, there was nothing there. Only the smell of rain and something foul like stagnant water. I didn't go back upstairs after that. Carl never asked why. He just nodded like he already knew. Over time, I learned to live with it. The laughter, the footsteps, the register that never stayed shut. I started leaving a glass of sweet wine on the counter at night, an old habit passed down by other bartenders before me. It seemed to help. The noises stayed gentle, the bottles calm. Then one night I forgot. It had been busy and I was too tired to think. I locked up and left without setting the glass out. When I came back the next morning, the front door was open. The candles had all burned out. Wax pooled across the counter like melted tears. Every single bottle on the shelves had been turned backward, labels facing the wall. And in the center of the bar, the register sat open with a single folded bill inside, creased into a perfect triangle. I placed the glass of wine back on the counter that night and whispered an apology into the quiet air. The bottles didn't rattle and the register stayed shut, but sometimes when the night is still and the wind dies completely, I swear I can hear the faint sound of children laughing upstairs. It doesn't scare me anymore. It just reminds me that in a place like La Carafe, some customers never really leave. The Magnolia Hotel in Seguin stands like a stone memory, a slab of Texas limestone weathered by 2 centuries of whispered stories. From the street it looks almost proud, its columns rising pale under the yellow streetlights, shutters hanging slightly crooked as though the building itself had grown tired of holding them straight. People in town say the place breathes at night. Some say it remembers. I booked a room there out of curiosity, thinking I could spend one quiet weekend inside its haunted walls and come out with a story. I was wrong about how quiet it would be. The front desk was an antique wooden counter, the kind that had seen more hands than a church pew. A woman in her 60s greeted me. Her name tag read Clara. She smiled in the polite, practiced way of someone who's seen too many ghost hunters and thrill seekers. The air smelled faintly of cedar polish and old paper. A brass bell sat by the ledger, though I never saw her use it. She handed me a heavy metal key attached to a worn leather tag that read, Room 6. As I turned to leave, she said softly, "If you hear tapping on the wall, don't tap back. It's not courteous to answer." I laughed awkwardly, assuming she meant it as part of the charm, but her eyes didn't match her smile. I took the narrow staircase up to the 2nd floor, where the hall stretched long and dim, lined with old portraits that seemed to have been painted just slightly wrong, eyes too far apart, mouths too soft like the artist had never seen a real person. My room was near the end. The door creaked open into a space that smelled faintly of lilac and mildew. The floorboard sagged under my feet. There was one small bed, a writing desk by the window, and a mirror whose silver backing had long begun to cloud. At first glance, the walls seemed ordinary. But when I drew the curtains closed that night, I noticed faint etchings beneath the paint. I leaned closer and saw letters, names, scratched into the plaster with something sharp. Lucille, Edgar, Miriam. Dozens of them, layered on top of one another, as though written over years. None looked recent, yet none were completely faded either. I thought of kids or guests wanting to leave a mark, like carving initials into a tree. Still, there was something desperate about the way the letters cut so deep, as if whoever made them needed to be remembered. I unpacked, brushed it off, and went downstairs to the parlor where a few other guests were sitting near the fire. 2 couples and an older man who looked like he lived there full-time. We chatted over coffee that Clara brought out on a tray. The older man, who introduced himself as Mr. Harper, told stories about the building. It had started as a stagecoach stop in the 1840s, then a courthouse, then a brothel, then a boarding house, then nothing for decades. During that time, people broke in, drifters, squatters, lovers looking for privacy. Not all of them left, he said with a thin smile. Sometimes the house keeps what it wants. I slept lightly that night, if you could call it sleep. Around 1 a.m. I heard tapping, light, deliberate, from the wall near my headboard. At first I assumed pipes or wood settling, but it followed a rhythm. Tap, tap, pause, tap. It sounded almost expectant. Clara's words echoed in my head, "Don't tap back." So I stayed still, trying to breathe evenly. The tapping continued for several minutes before stopping suddenly. I turned over, wide awake, and noticed something on the mirror across the room. The condensation from my breath had fogged part of it, revealing faint letters traced in the mist. Miriam. The same name from the wall. Morning brought false comfort. Sunlight made everything look smaller, harmless. I went downstairs, trying to act casual. Clara poured me coffee without asking. "You look pale," she said. I told her I'd heard tapping, maybe pipes, maybe the wind. Her expression didn't change. "It's not the wind," she said. "They get restless when someone new stays upstairs. Don't give them attention. They only want to be remembered." When I asked about the names, she looked toward the ceiling and said, "Some are guests. Some were here long before this was a hotel." Then she turned and busied herself with the ledger. Conversation closed. That afternoon, I wandered Seguin's quiet streets, visited the old courthouse, the park by the river. Everywhere I went, I kept thinking about those names. Who was Miriam? Why did she scratch her name into the wall of room 6? I stopped by the public library and found an old record book about the building. One newspaper clipping from 1874 caught my eye. An article about a woman named Miriam Hale who vanished after working as a maid at the Magnolia when it was a boarding house. Police suspected she'd run off, but townspeople claimed she'd been seen looking out an upstairs window for months afterward, long after she'd supposedly disappeared. I returned before dark. The air in the hallway was still and heavy. My key turned reluctantly in the lock, as though the door had swollen. Inside, something had changed. The names on the wall seemed sharper, fresher. I could swear new scratches had appeared. One that looked like Harper, though that couldn't be right. I pressed my fingers against the letters and felt the grooves cold and deep. That night, the tapping started earlier, around midnight, louder this time. I sat up, staring at the wall. The rhythm had changed, and slower, deliberate, almost like someone tracing letters. Then from the far corner, I heard a whisper. It sounded like a woman's voice saying, "Do you see me?" I wanted to run, but couldn't move. The mirror across the room clouded again, but this time I saw not just a name, but a shape. The outline of a face behind the glass, eyes wide and gray. My reflection seemed to blur, replaced by hers. Then, for an instant, I felt a rush of cold air against my cheek and the faint sound of someone breathing beside me. I tore the blanket off and fled the room, down the stairs barefoot, into the front lobby where the old clock ticked too loudly. Clara was sitting there in a chair as if she'd been waiting. She didn't ask what happened. She just nodded toward the key in my shaking hand. "If you leave now, leave it behind," she said. I dropped it onto the counter and noticed something carved into the leather tag I hadn't seen before. My name, neatly scratched beneath the number 6. My stomach turned. "How did that get there?" I whispered. She looked at me with tired eyes. "That's how they keep count." I drove away without looking back, but I couldn't shake the feeling of something pressing behind my ribs, a heaviness that followed me for days. When I finally unpacked at home, I found a small piece of limestone in my jacket pocket, smooth except for one corner where letters had been etched shallowly into the surface. My name again. No matter how many times I threw it out, it kept reappearing in different places. On my desk, in my car, once even on my nightstand. The last time I found it, I noticed a new word beneath my name, freshly carved, letters still rough to the touch. It read, "Room 7. I never went back to Seguin, but sometimes when the house is quiet, I hear faint tapping from inside the walls, patient and polite, waiting for me to answer. The limestone walls of Presidio La Bahia look harmless in the daylight. A squat fortress sitting quietly on the edge of Goliad, its whitewashed stones glowing in the South Texas sun. Tourists take pictures in front of the old wooden gates and stroll through the courtyard, listening to docents talk about the massacres and revolts that took place there centuries ago. But when the crowds leave and the air starts to cool, the place changes. The wind dies down, the birds stop singing, and an oppressive silence settles in, as if the walls themselves are holding their breath, remembering. I used to think ghost stories were for tourists. I was a park ranger at Goliad State Park, just a mile away, and part of my duty was checking on the Presidio grounds after hours. I'd worked nights before, campgrounds, trails, even the mission ruins, but nothing ever felt as wrong as those patrols around La Bahia. The first night I drew the shift, I remember locking my truck and walking toward the old fort with my flashlight cutting through the humid dark. It was late March, close to the anniversary of the Goliad massacre. The moon hung low over the plains, pale and heavy, the kind that makes everything look like it's underwater. The wind carried the faint smell of rain and cattle from the nearby fields. When I unlocked the gate, it groaned like something alive. Inside, the air grew still. My boots echoed too loudly on the stone path. I told myself it was just the acoustics, the way the walls trapped sound, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was walking behind me, matching each step. I turned once, twice, nothing. Just the dark arches and the faint outline of the chapel. I was supposed to make sure all doors were secured and the grounds were clear. I moved toward the soldiers' barracks, a narrow room with low ceilings and heavy beams. My light swept across old bunks and rough-hewn tables. Everything was still until I saw something on the far wall, a cluster of faint scratches near one of the cots. I leaned closer. It was a name, then another, then another. The stone was scarred with hundreds of them, etched deep into the plaster, some so old they were barely visible. I recognized a few, Anglo names, Spanish names, some only initials. I didn't think much of it then. Soldiers carving their names was common, but as I stepped back, I noticed something that made my stomach twist. One of the names was mine. Not just the same first name, not just the same last, it was mine, letter for letter. I stared at it for a long time, tracing the grooves with my fingers. The stone was cold, too cold. I told myself it was coincidence. Maybe someone in history shared my name. But then I noticed the dust along the edges of the scratch. It was fresh. That shook me enough that I cut my patrol short. I locked up and drove back to the station without writing it up. I didn't sleep much that night. The next day, I mentioned it to another ranger, Carlos, who had been around longer. He laughed at first, but when I told him exactly where the name was, he stopped smiling. He said, "Don't mess with that barracks room. Folks see things in there." When I asked what kind of things, he shrugged and said, "Names that don't belong, faces in the walls, whispers at dawn." I thought he was just trying to spook me, but he wouldn't look me in the eye. The next week, I got assigned there again. I tried to trade shifts, but nobody wanted that slot. So I went back. The sky was overcast that night, and the humidity made the air thick as soup. I took my time locking the outer gate, listening to the creak of metal and the faint sound of traffic from Highway 183. But once I crossed into the courtyard, the world fell silent again. I could hear my heartbeat. My flashlight beam jittered slightly, and I realized my hand was shaking. When I reached the chapel, I paused at the door. The hinges groaned softly as I pushed it open. Inside, candles from the earlier tour still burned low in the sconces, their wax pooling down the stone like melted skin. The scent of old incense hung in the air. I walked slowly down the aisle, my light catching on the crucifix above the altar. Something about the shadows felt wrong, like they were moving even though the flame was still. Then I heard it, a low murmur, almost a chant, coming from the direction of the sacristy. I froze. The sound wasn't loud, but it was distinct. Spanish words whispered quickly as if in prayer or desperation. I thought maybe someone had stayed behind. I followed the sound, careful not to make noise, and reached the side door. The whispering stopped. I pushed the door open. The room was empty. Dust drifted in the flashlight beam, and the walls seemed to sweat in the heat. But on the floor, someone had drawn something in chalk, a crude cross surrounded by circles and names. I recognized the handwriting. It was the same as the carvings in the barracks. One of the names at the bottom was mine again. I backed out of the room and nearly tripped over the threshold. My chest felt tight. I didn't finish the patrol that night either. I drove straight home and called in sick the next day, but I couldn't stay away from it. Curiosity, guilt, I don't know. A few nights later, I returned as a visitor. The place was open for a candlelight tour commemorating the massacre. Families, students, and a priest were there. They walked the grounds, lighting candles for the fallen. I hung near the back, trying to listen as the guide spoke about the prisoners who were executed at dawn in 1836, their bodies left in the fields. The priest said something that stuck with me. He said some of the souls never found peace because they died calling for mercy that never came. When the ceremony ended, I lingered near the chapel again. As the crowd left, the candles flickered lower and the night wind moved through the arches. Then faintly I heard it again, the same low whispering. I followed it, drawn like a moth. It led me to the barracks. The names on the wall were glowing faintly, like the stone itself was breathing light. I stood frozen as the temperature dropped so sharply my breath fogged. The whispering grew louder, overlapping voices pleading, sobbing, praying. I saw movement in the corner of my eye, shadows gathering in the doorway. Men in tattered uniforms, faces pale as ash, eyes hollow. One stepped forward, his mouth moving but no sound coming out. He raised his hand and pointed straight at me. The air seemed to fold in on itself, the pressure building until I thought my skull would split. I dropped my flashlight. The beam rolled across the floor and caught my reflection in a fragment of broken glass near the cot. Behind me, carved into the wall again, was my name. But now there was a date next to it. Tomorrow's. I woke up outside the fort at dawn, lying on the gravel road with dirt under my nails and the taste of blood in my mouth. My car keys were in my pocket, but my uniform shirt was gone. The gate was locked from the inside. I never told anyone what happened, not even Carlos. I quit the job 2 weeks later. Sometimes I still drive past Goliad on my way to Corpus. I always look toward the mission. It looks peaceful from the highway, bathed in sun, flags rippling in the breeze. But every time I pass, I feel that same pressure in my chest, like the air is too heavy to breathe. I know what's carved in that wall now, and I know one day, maybe when I'm old or maybe sooner, I'll have to go back. The Presidio keeps its names, and it never forgets the ones that are still missing. The Jefferson Hotel sits like a grand old ghost on Austin Street, its white columns rising out of the humid East Texas air like bones from the red clay. I'd driven through Jefferson a dozen times before, passing the antique stores and old brick buildings without much thought. But that night in late August, when I found myself stranded with a dead alternator and a storm rolling in from the bayou, the hotel was the only place with a vacancy. I remember standing under the covered porch while the rain came down hard enough to blur the gas lamps on the street. The sign swung back and forth on its iron chain, squealing in the wind, the words Jefferson Hotel peeling at the edges like old wallpaper. Inside, it smelled like lemon oil and mildew. The lobby was small but cluttered. Lace curtains, gilt-framed portraits of strangers, mirrors on every wall. The woman at the front desk had that old southern politeness that feels rehearsed, her voice slow and syrupy. "You'll be in room 12 tonight, sir. Up the stairs, second on your left." She smiled when I thanked her, but her eyes never left me as I crossed the hall. I remember because I could still feel her gaze as I climbed the creaking staircase, like she was waiting to see if I'd turn back. The hallway was lined with more mirrors, each warped slightly, old glass with black streaks like veins. My reflection trailed me in uneven shapes, shoulders bending, face stretching. Every few feet, I'd catch a glimpse of a woman standing just behind me in the glass. A figure dressed in lace, her hair pinned up, eyes pale and still. But when I turned, the hall was empty except for the flickering light from a chandelier that trembled with every thunderclap. Room 12 was smaller than I expected, with a brass bed, lace curtains, and an old vanity against the far wall. I noticed right away that every surface seemed to reflect something. The mirror above the dresser, the glass front wardrobe, even the polished doorknob. Outside, the rain had settled into a steady rhythm against the windows, and the streetlights below glowed faintly through the lace. I set my bag down and tried to shake off the feeling that the place was too still, as if the air itself was listening. I took a shower in the clawfoot tub, the pipes rattling like something alive in the walls. When I came out, steam clinging to the mirror, I saw a handprint already forming in the fog, small, slender fingers pressed into the glass from the inside. I wiped it away, thinking I'd imagined it, but another appeared lower down, then another beside it. My reflection warped between them, my face splitting down the middle by streaks of condensation. The light flickered once, then went out completely. I stood there, water dripping from my hair, the air heavy with that smell of wet plaster and old perfume. I heard the doorknob twist behind me, slow and deliberate, metal scraping against metal. I froze. The only sound was the rain, then a soft voice, female, distant, almost a whisper, saying something I couldn't make out. The knob turned again, harder this time, rattling in its socket. When I opened the bathroom door, the room was dark except for the glow from the streetlight through the lace curtains. The bedspread had been turned down. I hadn't done that. My suitcase was open, clothes folded neatly beside it, and in the mirror above the vanity, a woman's face looked back at me. She stood directly behind my reflection, but the room itself was empty. Her eyes were glassy, unfocused, and her mouth was moving, forming words I couldn't hear. Her skin was as white as the lace curtains. I backed away slowly until my legs hit the bed frame. The air was colder now, my breath showing faintly. I didn't sleep much. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear footsteps in the hallway, slow, dragging steps that paused right outside my door. The doorknob would tremble, the brass clicking softly. Around 2 in the morning, I gave up pretending to rest and sat at the window. Jefferson was silent. The storm had moved on, leaving the streets wet and shining. Across the road, a woman stood under the street lamp, wearing a white dress that clung to her shoulders. Her head tilted up toward my window. She didn't move, didn't blink. I thought maybe she was another guest, but when a car passed, its headlights went straight through her. I packed my things before sunrise. When I came down to the lobby, the woman from the front desk wasn't there. A different clerk sat behind the counter, a man this time older with a cigarette balanced between two fingers. I told him about the woman I'd seen, about the mirrors and the voices, about the door turning on its own. He listened quietly, then stubbed out his cigarette and said, "You were in room 12? When I nodded, he exhaled slowly. "That room gets cleaned last, always has. We don't usually rent it out, but I guess she didn't know that last night." I asked who he meant. He didn't answer at first, just stared at the front doors like he expected someone to walk in. Finally, he said she was a guest here. Long time ago. Bride, supposedly. Her fiancé left her waiting on the wedding day. Folks say she hung herself in that room right in front of the vanity. His voice dropped to almost a whisper. Sometimes people see her reflection when they shouldn't. I checked out without another word. As I stepped onto the porch, the morning sun was already breaking through the clouds. I turned once to look back through the lobby window, and for just a moment I saw her standing behind the counter. Lace dress, pale skin, the same dead eyes I'd seen in the mirror. The reflection vanished as soon as the light hit it, like smoke in a draft. I drove out of Jefferson with the windows down, the radio low, the air thick with the smell of rain and pine. But when I glanced at the rearview mirror, the back seat wasn't empty. There was a smear across the glass like someone had pressed their hand there from the inside, and faintly in the reflection of the road behind me I saw her face once more, silent, unblinking, following me all the way out of town. The Emily Morgan Hotel rises over Alamo Plaza like a stone sentinel, its Gothic spires stabbing into the San Antonio sky. Locals call it beautiful, even romantic, but when I checked in one muggy August evening, I felt none of that. The air was thick with heat and something older, something that didn't quite move with the rest of the world. I was in town for a historical symposium of all things, but I'd booked the Emily Morgan because it was close to the Alamo, and because I'd always been fascinated by stories of hauntings that clung to old buildings. I didn't expect to feel it, not really. Not the way I did as soon as I walked through those brass-framed doors. The air smelled faintly of bleach and flowers that had died 2 days ago. The woman at the front desk greeted me with the same polished smile every hotel clerk wears. Her name tag said Isabel, and when I asked about the history of the place, she hesitated before replying that the hotel used to be a medical building during the early 1900s. The upper floors had been offices, the mid-levels were surgery wards, and the basement, she glanced toward the elevator then, had been the morgue. I joked that I'd try to avoid that floor. She didn't laugh. Instead, she handed me my key card and said softly, "The elevators sometimes forget." I thought she was being dramatic. I've always had a fascination for ghost stories, but I'm a rational man. I teach history. I write papers. I look for facts buried under myth. Still, as the elevator doors closed and I pressed the button for the 7th floor, I couldn't help watching the digital numbers glow, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, before they suddenly stopped. The elevator jolted and began to slow, then the screen blinked. It read B. I hadn't pressed the basement button. The elevator came to a stop, and for a few seconds nothing happened. The lights flickered, dimmed, then steadied again. I thought about pressing door close, but curiosity, it's a dangerous thing, made me reach for door open instead. They slid apart with a sluggish hiss, releasing a gust of air that was much colder than it had any right to be. The basement wasn't lit like the rest of the hotel. The hallway beyond looked half forgotten, concrete instead of carpet, dim yellow bulbs instead of the warm glow upstairs. I could hear a faint dripping sound, rhythmic and hollow, echoing somewhere out of sight. I told myself to step out just for a moment to look. Maybe the hotel stored supplies down here. Maybe this was nothing more than a service area. The air, though, it was thick, stagnant, and heavy with the smell of old metal. When I exhaled, my breath came out visible, a pale ghost hanging in front of me even though it was August in Texas. The doors began to close on their own, and some primitive instinct made me jump back inside. As they slid shut, I caught a glimpse of something down the hall, a figure faint and gray as if seen through a film of water. It was standing very still near the end of the corridor, just far enough that I couldn't make out a face. Then the doors sealed, The elevator shuddered and we began to rise again. The display blinked to life. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. When I reached my floor, I tried to laugh it off. I unpacked, turned on the TV, even went down later for dinner in the restaurant where a couple of businessmen were arguing about something trivial. But the entire time I couldn't stop replaying what I'd seen. It hadn't looked like a trick of light. It had been shaped like a person, but wrong somehow, too still, too silent. I told myself it was fatigue. I'd been on the road for 6 hours. I needed sleep. That night, I woke to the sound of the elevator bell. It wasn't close, it was somewhere down the hall. But it kept ringing again and again like someone was pressing the button over and over. Then came the hum of the cables and the soft ding of arrival. I waited for the footsteps that should follow. None came. I looked at the clock. 1:00 a.m. The elevator bell rang again. I got up and went to the door listening. The hallway was empty. The carpet muffled every sound, but I could feel vibrations under my feet, subtle and continuous like machinery straining somewhere nearby. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant again. I cracked the door open and looked toward the elevators. The light above one of them flickered from 7 to 6 to 5, then back to 7. The doors opened and shut several times, empty each time. I watched for nearly a minute before I closed my door, slid the deadbolt, and told myself to stop letting my imagination run wild. The next morning, I asked Isabel if the elevator ever acted up. Her polite smile faltered, then she nodded. Sometimes the controls get confused, she said, especially around the lower levels. I asked if there really was a morgue once. Her expression went blank for a moment, then she said, "Several floors, actually. The basement, but also the 5th and 6th. They stored the bodies of soldiers after the Alamo siege before they were moved." I waited for her to laugh, to tell me it was a local myth. She didn't. Instead, she looked past me toward the elevator doors and said, almost to herself, "Some say the building remembers." That phrase followed me all day. The building remembers. I walked the river walk, visited the Alamo, listened to guides talk about heroism and sacrifice. But in the back of my mind, I kept seeing that flickering display. B. That night, I told myself I'd take the stairs. But old habits die hard, and when I returned from dinner, arms full of papers and my laptop, I pressed the elevator button anyway. The doors opened immediately, as if waiting. Inside, the mirrored walls reflected me back from every angle, slightly distorted, pale under the fluorescent light. I pressed 7. The elevator descended. I hit the button again. Nothing. The display blinked once, then shifted. B. The hum beneath my feet deepened, slower this time, as if we were sinking instead of moving. When the doors opened, I was met with the same dim corridor, the same dripping sound. But this time the lights were brighter, and I saw that the walls were tiled, the kind of old glazed tile you find in hospitals. A stretcher lay tipped against one wall, rust blooming across its frame. The air smelled like wet linen and decay. A sound echoed, metal scraping concrete. I told myself to stay calm, to document it, to rationalize it. I stepped out, phone in hand, recording. The video light barely cut through the darkness, but I caught glimpses. An old examination table, an open doorway leading to a room lined with white cabinets, their paint peeling. The scraping came again, closer now, rhythmic like something being dragged. I aimed the phone toward the sound. There was movement, slow and deliberate. A shadow bent at the edge of the frame, something human-shaped but not moving right. It tilted its head like it was listening. My breath caught. Then every light in the corridor flickered out. I ran for the elevator, heart hammering, hitting the button so hard I thought I'd break it. The doors opened just as something moved behind me. A whisper of fabric, a soft metallic clink like surgical tools shifting in a tray. I dove inside, slammed my hand on close, and felt the air change. The smell of antiseptic thickening, the temperature dropping until I could see the frost forming on the mirror. My reflection blurred, then darkened. For an instant, there was another shape beside me, standing shoulder to shoulder. A woman in an old nurse's uniform, her eyes dark hollows, her face too pale to be alive. Then she was gone. The elevator doors opened on the 7th floor. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I packed before dawn and waited in the lobby until the first light touched the windows. When I checked out, Isabel didn't ask why. She just handed me the receipt and said quietly, "You took the basement." As I stepped out into the morning heat, I glanced back at the building. The sun caught its limestone facade, warm and golden, hiding everything that had happened beneath. I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it all. Almost. But later, when I watched the footage on my phone, my blood ran cold. The video was short, grainy, but clear enough. When I panned toward the sound in that basement, the shadow wasn't just standing there. It was wearing a uniform, a nurse's cap, and as it turned toward the camera, I heard it whisper one word, faint but distinct. Remember. Bragg Road cuts through the big thicket like a scar that refuses to heal. A single-lane dirt track stretching from Saratoga to Batson, lined with pine and cypress that seem to close in tighter the deeper you go. Even in daylight, it feels wrong. The trees lean too close, the light never quite reaches the ground, and the air carries that heavy metallic stillness you only feel in places that have seen too much. Locals call it Ghost Road, but outsiders know it as Bragg Road. And if you drive it long enough after dark, they say you'll see a light hovering in the distance, swaying like a lantern in an unseen hand. I never believed in it. I grew up around Saratoga, hearing old men at the gas station tell the same story every summer. A brakeman from the early 1900s, decapitated in a rail accident, doomed to wander the forest searching for his missing head, his lantern forever swinging as he searches for the train that left him behind. Kids used to dare each other to drive down there at night, to turn off the headlights and wait. I was one of them once. But that was years ago, before life had taught me that some stories don't fade just because you stop believing in them. It was late September when I went back. My younger cousin Mark had just bought a used truck and was bragging about it, so we decided to test it on Bragg Road. We picked up 2 friends, Lisa and Cody, and set off after midnight, armed with nothing but a flashlight, some beer, and a playlist of classic rock that barely cut through the cicadas. The road started innocent enough, just a dusty stretch between the pines, the stars bright and indifferent above. But within 10 minutes, the trees closed in, the night deepened, and the hum of insects began to fade like something was swallowing the sound. Mark laughed it off, cracked open another beer, and said we'd better see that famous light or he wanted his gas money back. But Lisa wasn't laughing. She was watching the woods. Every now and then she'd glance into the darkness like she thought something was keeping pace with us just beyond the tree line. I teased her at first until I started noticing it too. A faint shimmer between the trees, almost like a reflection. Cody leaned forward from the back seat and told Mark to slow down. "You see that?" he whispered. And there it was, maybe 200 yards ahead, a pale, wavering light hovering at eye level above the road. It wasn't steady like a car headlight or a flashlight beam. It swayed gently side to side, just like someone walking and carrying a lantern. We stopped the truck. The light stopped too. Nobody spoke for a full 10 seconds. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. Then Mark muttered, "It's some kid with a flashlight," and revved the engine. The light didn't move. We drove forward, slow and cautious. The glow stayed the same distance away, never growing closer, never fading back. We drove like that for half a mile. The air got colder. My breath fogged the glass even though it was still early fall. The smell of iron filled the cab, sharp and thick like rust and blood mixed together. Lisa started whispering prayers under her breath. Mark laughed nervously and said he'd floor it to catch whoever was messing with us. He slammed the gas and the truck roared forward, tires kicking dust. But the light stayed exactly where it was, floating just ahead, taunting us. Then just as suddenly it vanished, gone. The road ahead swallowed by darkness. Mark stopped the truck again. The silence outside was absolute. Not a single insect, not even wind, just the faint ticking of the engine cooling. Cody said we should turn around. Lisa nodded fast, tears shining in her eyes. But Mark refused. "I've come this far," he said, gripping the wheel. "I just want to see where it went." He eased forward again, slower this time. We passed under branches that hung low enough to scrape the roof. The headlights caught something pale in the dirt, an old section of railroad track half buried and rusted to nothing. And then the smell hit us again, stronger this time, like burning metal and wet earth. I turned toward the woods, and that's when I saw it. A figure between the trees, maybe 10 yards off the road. It was tall, lean, dressed in what looked like dark work clothes. In one hand it held a lantern, glowing the same pale white as before. But where its head should have been, there was nothing. Just a jagged stump of darkness that seemed to bleed light. I couldn't breathe. The lantern swung once, twice, then the figure started moving toward us. Not walking exactly, but gliding, each step silent as smoke. Mark tried to start the truck, but the engine sputtered. He cursed, turned the key again and again, nothing. The headlights flickered and died. We were swallowed by darkness, except for the soft white glow approaching through the trees. Lisa screamed. Cody started praying. I just sat there, frozen, watching the light grow brighter, brighter until it filled the cab with cold white glare. Then it was gone. The truck roared back to life by itself. The lights came on. The road ahead was empty. Mark hit the gas and didn't let up until we reached the highway. Nobody said a word the entire ride back. When we finally pulled into town, the clock on the dash said 3:17 a.m., but when I checked my phone, it was only 2:03. Somehow we'd lost more than an hour. I didn't sleep that night. None of us did. Cody texted the next day saying he was moving back to Beaumont. Lisa wouldn't return my calls. Mark pretended it never happened. But I kept thinking about the light, how it followed us, how it seemed to react when we stopped. I tried telling myself it was swamp gas, headlights from another road, anything that made sense. But 2 nights later, I went outside to smoke and saw a faint white glow at the edge of the woods behind my house. It swayed, slowly, rhythmically, like someone walking with a lantern. I haven't been back to Bragg Road since, but sometimes late at night when the air smells of iron and the wind stops dead, I swear I can see that same light through the trees, and when I do, I turn off every light in the house, sit perfectly still and wait for it to pass. Because I know if I move, if I look too long, he'll think I'm trying to lead him back to his train, and I'm not sure he remembers he's dead. Under the pale glare of a West Texas sunset, Terlingua looks like a town that never decided whether it wanted to stay dead or come back. The wind snakes between the crumbling stone houses, stirring up dust that glows like ash in the sinking light. I remember the first time I drove through Brewster County and saw the sign pointing toward Terlingua Ghost Town. I had been chasing quiet, hoping to take a few days away from everything. No cell signal, no deadlines, no traffic humming in my ears. The desert always had that pull for me. It looks empty, but it listens. When I got there, the first thing that hit me was how still it felt. The air was heavy with heat, even though the sun had already started to bleed out behind the Chisos Mountains. The ruins of the old mining town were scattered across the hills like bones. Stone walls still stood in crooked shapes and wooden beams sagged under their own age. The ground was full of little fragments of bottles, rusted tin, and nails so old they flaked apart when you touched them. The cemetery sat on a low rise, surrounded by brittle crosses, each one leaning a little differently. I parked my truck near the old Starlight Theater and walked out toward the graveyard as the last orange streaks disappeared behind the ridge. Locals said that's when Terlingua wakes up. Sunlight dies slow here, they said, and the shadows stretch their legs before the dark settles in. I didn't believe that kind of thing, not really. But there's something about the desert twilight that makes even a skeptic keep their head on a swivel. I heard someone humming as I climbed the path toward the graves. It was low and thin, like the tune was being carried by the wind. I looked around, but there wasn't a soul in sight. Just the flicker of candles left on some of the graves. The wax melted into pools that looked like spilled light. The hum grew clearer when I reached the center of the graveyard. It sounded like a man's voice now, deep and rhythmic, almost a chant. I thought maybe someone was performing some kind of local ritual or holding a memorial. The people here were strange in the way small desert towns always are. Quiet, secretive, protective of what's theirs. But when I stepped between two graves to get a better look, the sound stopped completely. There was no one there. Just a field of stones, crosses, and mounds, and beyond them, the black outlines of the old mine shafts against the deep blue sky. Something flickered in my peripheral vision. I turned and saw a shadow slide across one of the headstones. It moved like it had weight, stretching and retracting, bending around the grave marker before pulling itself upright again. The air shifted cold against my neck. I told myself it was a trick of the light, maybe a cloud crossing the sun, though there were no clouds left in the sky. I tried to laugh it off and turned back toward the town, but I swear I heard footsteps behind me. Slow, dragging, uneven. When I reached the truck, I looked back once more. The graveyard was still and dark, but I could make out shapes moving between the stones. Long, thin shadows gliding from one grave to another, like something pacing out the perimeter. I started the engine and headed down the dirt road toward my rental cabin. Dust trailed behind me like smoke, and for a while the headlights picked up nothing but the empty desert. Then halfway down the road, something appeared in the mirror. A figure standing in the middle of the path, not moving, not walking, just there. I slowed down, thinking maybe it was a local out for a walk, but when I turned my head to check, the road was empty again. The cabin sat on a rise overlooking the town. The owner had told me it was built on old foundations from the 1920s and warned me about the wind. It could make the windows rattle like someone tapping to get in. That night, it did more than that. Around midnight, I woke to a low humming again. The same one I'd heard near the cemetery. It came from somewhere below the floorboards, deep and muffled. The air was colder than before. I checked the door, made sure it was locked, and then crouched down to listen closer. I heard whispering. It wasn't clear enough to make out the words, but it had that unmistakable rhythm of voices taking turns. When I pressed my ear to the floor, something knocked back from underneath. 3 short taps, slow and deliberate. I didn't sleep after that. I sat in the chair by the window, watching the town below. A faint light flickered in the graveyard again. Not candlelight this time, but bluish-white like static. It darted between the headstones, brightening and dimming. For a moment, it looked almost human in shape. A figure holding a lantern, swinging it side to side as if searching for something. Then just as suddenly, it vanished. The night fell silent again. The next morning, I went into town for breakfast at the little cafe near the trading post. The waitress, an older woman with weathered hands, poured my coffee and said I looked like I'd seen a ghost. I told her I hadn't slept, that I kept hearing things around the cabin. She nodded like it wasn't news to her. "You're staying up on the ridge?" she asked. "That place sits on the old mine tunnels. Folks buried near there don't rest easy. Miners died down in those shafts. Some were never brought up." She leaned closer. "They say when the ground cools at night, you can still hear them trying." That evening, I decided I'd had enough. I packed my bag and planned to leave before dark, but curiosity got the better of me. Before I left town, I drove up to the old cemetery one last time. The light was thin and gray, and the wind had picked up. It blew through the desert like a sigh, carrying grit that stung the skin. I parked outside the gate and walked in slowly. I don't know what I was looking for. Maybe proof that what I'd seen was just tricks of exhaustion and nerves. The graves looked different in daylight, ordinary almost, but something about the air felt wrong. It vibrated faintly as if there were a heartbeat in the ground. Then I saw it. A fresh mound of earth near the center of the yard. No flowers, no marker. Just a small wooden cross with no name carved into it. It hadn't been there the night before. I knelt down and brushed the dust off the base of the cross. There was something etched shallowly into the wood. Letters faint enough to be mistaken for cracks. My own last name. I froze. The wind died completely. Behind me, gravel crunched. I turned, but there was no one there. The shadows between the graves had thickened again, even though the sun was still up. They leaned together, merging and bending, their edges shivering in the heat. A voice came from among them, low and steady. "You shouldn't have come back." The sound wasn't loud, but it carried through the stillness like thunder. The air turned sharp and metallic, tasting like old blood. My vision wavered. The graves seemed to sink and rise, the crosses swaying like they were breathing. I backed toward the gate, trying to keep my eyes on the moving shadows, but the ground felt soft under my feet, like sand giving way. I looked down and saw boot prints forming in the dust beside mine, deep, heavy, each step landing just after I moved. I bolted for the truck, slammed the door, and turned the key. The engine coughed twice before it caught. In the mirror, the graveyard looked farther away than it should have, like the distance had stretched somehow. Still, I could see something standing at the gate now, something tall and thin holding what looked like a lantern. The light swayed once, then winked out. I didn't stop driving until I hit the main highway. The sun was gone, and the desert around me was all shadow. I don't remember the rest of the drive clearly, only that I never looked in the mirror again. I got home 2 days later and told myself I'd imagined it all, that the desert does strange things to the mind. But sometimes when I close my eyes at night, I hear that hum again, low, patient, just beneath the floorboards of my house. And once, last month, I woke to find dust on my bedroom floor. Boot prints leading from the door to the window, and in the corner something faintly glowing like a small lantern swinging in the dark. In Crosby, Texas, there's a subdivision that looks like any other from the highway. Neat driveways, trimmed lawns, mailboxes standing like sentinels at the curb. But if you ask anyone who's lived there long enough, they'll tell you the land isn't right. It feels heavy, like the ground's holding its breath. They call it the Black Hope neighborhood, built on the bones of what used to be Black Hope Cemetery. Most of the graves had no markers. Some never even had names. The developers said they cleared it all, but that was a lie. The dead don't move just because you tell them to. I moved there with my wife, Lena, in the summer of 1991. Houston's heat could melt your thoughts, and Crosby was quieter, close enough to the city for work, far enough to breathe. We bought a pale yellow house on the corner of Poppet Street. It was our first home, and I remember standing in the empty living room thinking it felt peaceful, though the silence was oddly thick. The realtor mentioned the ground used to be old farmland, avoiding my eyes when she said it. We didn't care. The price was good, and the foundation was solid. At least that's what we thought. The first time something strange happened was during the rain. Texas storms come fast and mean, and one evening lightning struck close enough to make the windows tremble. The lights flickered and the radio in the kitchen snapped on by itself, whispering static. Lena called for me, her voice small. I was already standing in the hallway, staring at the flickering bulbs. They pulsed like a heartbeat. Then, for half a second, every light in the house glowed bright white before dying completely. The storm moved on. But when I checked the breaker box, everything was normal. When the lights came back, I noticed muddy footprints leading from the back door toward the laundry room. Bare feet, small ones. I thought maybe Lena had stepped in, something outside, but she was upstairs and the prints were still wet. After that, it became hard to shake the feeling that we were being watched. At night, we'd hear tapping like fingers on glass. Sometimes it came from the hallway window, sometimes from the ceiling above our bed. I'd get up, check outside, and find nothing but the oak trees shifting in the wind. The sound always stopped the moment I stepped closer. We tried to brush it off as house-settling noises, but deep down we both knew better. There was something aware of us. A few weeks later, our neighbor Sam came over. He was a retired mechanic, lived 2 houses down, and had the look of a man who'd seen too much and learned not to talk about it. He mentioned that he'd been in the neighborhood since the early construction days. They built all this right on top of a colored cemetery, he said, lowering his voice. Old freedmen from after the war. Folks tried to warn the developers, but they didn't listen. You dig too deep around here, you find more than roots. That night I couldn't sleep. Around 2 a.m, I got up and looked out the back window. There was movement in the yard, a dim shimmer like heat rising off asphalt. Then it took shape, just a faint outline of someone standing near the fence. Too still, too tall. I blinked and it was gone. The grass where it stood was pressed down, wet though it hadn't rained. Lena started having dreams soon after. She'd wake up shaking, saying she saw people standing around the bed, their faces wet with mud, whispering something she couldn't understand. She began leaving lights on at night. I started sleeping with the TV on, letting the blue glow push back the dark. But the worst came in early October, when we decided to dig for a swimming pool. The soil was thick clay and sand, and the crew had to bring in a backhoe to cut deep enough. Around the 3rd day, the foreman came to the door looking pale. He said they'd hit something, wood, maybe old debris. We walked out, and I saw the top of a rotted wooden box. It wasn't much bigger than a casket. The workers refused to keep going. When I brushed some dirt away, I saw a scrap of fabric and what looked like bone. A human femur, white and smooth from years underground. Lena screamed, and the foreman called the sheriff. The investigation was short. The county officials confirmed. It was part of the old Black Hope Cemetery, supposedly relocated decades ago. They offered a quiet apology and told us to rebury what we'd disturbed. That night we recovered the hole ourselves, the smell of wet earth clinging to our clothes. I remember hearing something soft as we worked, like humming. It came from the ground, a low tune with no words. I didn't tell Lena. After that, the house changed. The air felt charged like before lightning strikes. Electrical things went haywire. Clocks rewound themselves. Appliances switched on at random. Once, while I was shaving, the radio in the Bedroom blared a gospel hymn from a station that didn't exist. The static carried voices, layered, distant like a congregation underwater. The walls sometimes trembled softly at night as if the house was breathing. We stopped talking about it to anyone. Sam came by once more, said his own yard lights had started blinking every time it rained. He told me 2 houses down, a couple moved out after their sinkhole opened up to reveal another coffin. He looked tired when he said, "They just want rest." This land was never meant for swimming pools. In late November, Lena fell sick. It started with headaches, then dizziness, then hallucinations. She said she saw people walking through the house during the night, trailing dirt and water behind them. One morning she pointed at the hallway mirror and said someone was standing beside me, an old man with sunken eyes. I turned, but the air was empty. Still, the room felt crowded, like too many lungs were breathing at once. The last night we lived there, the storm came back. Rain hammered the windows, thunder rolled across the fields, and every light flickered madly. Then the power died. The whole neighborhood went black. I heard movement downstairs, slow, dragging footsteps across the tile. Lena clutched my arm and whispered that someone was in the house. I grabbed the flashlight and went down. The beam caught water dripping from the ceiling, though the roof had never leaked before. The floor was slick with mud. In the kitchen, the radio hissed again. Through the static came a woman's voice, faint and pleading. "Please don't cover us again." I dropped the flashlight. It spun across the floor and for a split second illuminated something by the back door. A figure, soaked, its eyes open but empty. Its mouth moved without sound. Then it was gone. We left that night. Never went back except to collect what we could. The new owners filled the pool hole with cement and swore they didn't believe in ghost stories. A year later, I saw a local news clip. Lights flickering again after a storm. Another homeowner reporting whispers near their yard. They said the power lines were old, the wiring unstable. Maybe. But sometimes, when it rains hard enough, I still hear the faint hum of that radio. A choir of voices buried beneath the thunder, singing for anyone who disturbed their rest. The lights always flicker right before the song begins. When I first moved to the outskirts of San Antonio, I didn't know much about the little stretch of road that ran over Woman Hollering Creek. I'd passed it a few times on my way to work. An old 2-lane bridge with faded guardrails and a sign pocked with bullet holes. The creek itself looked harmless, just a trickle of water winding through mesquite and cattails, the kind of place you might see a kid fishing or a couple having a picnic. But locals said it wasn't a place you lingered after dark. They said a woman wandered its banks at night, crying for the children she'd drowned long ago. They said if you ever heard her laugh instead of cry, it meant she'd already seen you. I didn't believe in that kind of thing. I'm not sure I do even now, but I can't drive over that bridge anymore. I can't even hear running water without thinking about that night. It started simple. I'd rented a small house not far from the creek, a pale yellow place with peeling shutters and a porch that sagged in the middle. It was cheap, quiet, and close to work. The real estate agent mentioned the flooding risk once, almost as a joke. "Only when it rains real hard," she'd said, fanning herself with a brochure. "Just don't go walking down there after dark. Folks say La Llorona still keeps watch." I laughed it off then. I shouldn't have. For the first few weeks, life there was uneventful. I worked late shifts at a distribution warehouse and usually drove home around midnight. The highway was empty at that hour, and the road dipped low as it approached the bridge. Every time I crossed, I felt a strange heaviness like the air pressed against me. Once or twice, I caught movement in the corner of my eye, a shimmer like mist clinging to the creek. I told myself it was fog or headlights. The first real sign something was wrong came one rainy Thursday night. The storm had been pounding all evening, wind shaking the windows of the warehouse. By the time I clocked out, the parking lot was half flooded. My tires hissed through puddles all the way home. The wipers could barely keep up. When I reached the bridge, my headlights cut across sheets of rain, flashing over the black water below. That's when I saw her. She stood at the far end of the bridge, right in the middle of my lane. White dress plastered against her body, hair hanging in dripping ropes. I slammed on the brakes, heart pounding. For a second, I thought I'd hit her, but when the car stopped, she was gone. Just gone. I sat there gripping the wheel, listening to the rain hammering the roof. Then I heard it, a sound so faint I thought I imagined it at first. A sob, soft and drawn out, echoing from under the bridge. I told myself it was the wind and kept driving. But the whole way home I felt like someone was sitting in the back seat, breathing slow and wet. That night sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes I saw that white shape in the road. Around 3 in the morning I woke up to a noise that didn't belong in a quiet house. It was a woman crying. The sound came from the back porch, muffled by the rain still falling outside. I got up, half angry, half scared, and went to the window. The yard was empty except for the wet grass glinting in the security light. But the crying didn't stop. It just moved. First by the porch, then near the fence, then somewhere by the trees. I turned on the porch light. The bulb flickered once and went out. That's when the crying changed. It turned into laughter. Not loud, not shrieking, just low and hollow. The way someone laughs when they've been crying for a long time and finally give up. The sound slid through me like ice water. I grabbed my phone and called a friend from work, babbling about someone outside, but the call kept cutting out. I must have looked ridiculous pacing that living room, whispering to a dead line, waiting for the sound to stop. When it finally did, I locked every window and sat on the couch until sunrise. The next morning, everything looked normal again. The ground was soaked, the creek swollen but calm. I convinced myself I'd overreacted. People hear things when they're tired. But when I walked out to the car, I noticed something strange. Muddy footprints on the porch. Small ones like a child's. They led from the steps to the door and then stopped. No adult prints beside them. No tracks leading away, just a dozen tiny imprints ending at my threshold. I called the landlord that afternoon and asked if anyone else had lived there recently. She hesitated before answering. Couple with 2 kids, she said. They left after the flood 2 summers ago. That night I dreamed I was standing on the bridge again. The water below shimmered under the moonlight, and a woman was kneeling on the bank washing something red out of her dress. When she turned, her eyes were black and full of running water. She opened her mouth and I woke up to the sound of crying again, this time inside the house. I searched every room, every closet, nothing. But when I reached the bathroom, I saw water dripping from the ceiling. A slow, steady trickle. The roof didn't leak, not even in storms. But the water kept falling, pooling on the tile. Then as I stared, I saw a ripple in the reflection of the floor. A face formed in it, pale and stretched, lips trembling as if whispering something underwater. I backed out and slammed the door. The crying stopped. My chest hurt from breathing so fast. I didn't sleep at all that night. By dawn, I'd packed a bag and decided to stay at a motel for a few days. But when I started the car, the radio turned on by itself. I hadn't touched it. Static hissed, then a voice came through. A woman's, faint and distant. I couldn't make out the words, but she was singing. The melody was soft, like a lullaby. It went on for nearly a minute before cutting out, leaving only static and the sound of the creek outside. I left anyway. The motel was 20 minutes away, but I never made it. When I crossed the bridge again, the car sputtered and died right in the middle. Headlights dimmed, engine gone silent. I tried the ignition 3 times, nothing. Rain started again, sudden and heavy. My hand shook as I reached for the flashlight. That's when I saw her in the mirror, standing behind the car, drenched, eyes reflecting the beam like glass. She was smiling. Not weeping, not screaming, smiling. Her teeth were small and dark, her mouth too wide. And as she stepped closer, the sound that came out of her wasn't a sob. It was laughter. I don't remember getting out. I just remember running. The road slick under my feet, the laughter chasing me, echoing from every direction. I didn't stop until I saw the lights of the gas station a mile up. By the time I looked back, the rain had stopped. The bridge was empty. The tow truck driver found my car the next morning, engine flooded but otherwise fine. He said the keys were still in the ignition, the radio on, playing faint static. He asked if I'd dropped anything because he'd found a child's shoe wedged under the driver's seat. I told him it wasn't mine. I moved out that week. I left most of my things behind. Sometimes, though, when it rains here in San Antonio, I still hear her on the edge of hearing, crying, sometimes laughing, sometimes both. And I wonder if she's still down there by the bridge, waiting for someone foolish enough to stop and listen. Because the worst part isn't that she weeps for her children, it's that she finds new ones. El Paso High School sits on a hill like a monument. its brick walls the color of rusted blood under the desert sun. It looks over the city like something that's been watching for far too long. The air around it always feels still, like it's holding its breath. People in El Paso call it the Lady on the Hill, but nobody says that name after dark. They say that if you drive past it at night and stare too long, the windows seem to move. The glass looks like it ripples, like water trying to remember a face. I took a teaching job there in 2015. The district was desperate for substitutes, and I was new in town, renting a tiny apartment off Montana Avenue. From the outside, the school looked impressive. Columns, arched windows, a football field that faced the mountains. But once inside, it felt colder than any building that size should. Even in August, the air had a strange chill that didn't match the weather. The faculty room was on the second floor near the auditorium. Everyone had stories. They said students saw figures in the halls after the last bell. Reflections that didn't match their movements. Doors that opened on their own. A math teacher swore she heard the marching band playing when she stayed late, though the band room had been locked for years. I laughed with them because that's what you do when you're new, but I stopped laughing the first time I stayed after hours. It was a Thursday. I had detention duty. Only 2 students showed up, both freshmen, quiet and bored. They finished early, and by 4:30 they were gone. I stayed to grade papers. When I finally looked up, it was nearly 6. The sun had dipped low enough that the light through the tall windows looked thick and orange, dust swirling in it like smoke. I packed my bag and started down the hall. That's when I heard footsteps. They weren't faint. They were slow and steady, rubber soles squeaking just slightly on the waxed tile. I turned, expecting one of the janitors, but the corridor was empty. The sound stopped when I did. I waited. Nothing. Then, as I began walking again, the footsteps started too, perfectly matching my pace, only a few yards behind. I forced myself not to run. The hallway stretched longer than it should have, every door closed, every window throwing back a reflection that didn't belong to me. When I reached the stairwell, the noise stopped completely. I half laughed, half cursed under my breath, and went down the steps. The first floor was dark except for the faint glow from the exit sign at the end of the hall. My shoes echoed on the floor. Halfway to the door, I noticed something faint on the trophy case glass. A smudge shaped like a handprint, small and pale, pressed against the inside. I stepped closer and saw more of them, dozens overlapping each other like frost. I left the building fast that night. The next morning, I told one of the older teachers about it. She smiled the way people do when they've heard it all before. "You'll get used to it," she said. "Just don't stay after 6. That's when the lights act up." I wanted to ask what she meant, but the bell rang and the hallway filled with noise. The lights didn't just act up. They flickered in patterns like signals. Some students said they formed words in Morse code. Others claimed they saw faces in the reflection of the glass doors leading to the old gym. The school's been rebuilt and renovated dozens of times, but parts of it, the auditorium, the basement tunnels, date back to the early 1900s. There's a section under the west wing sealed off after a landslide decades ago. They say workers died down there, trapped in the dark. A month into my job, yearbook photos were taken. I supervised one of the sessions. It was routine, loud, chaotic. Kids fixing their hair, posing, laughing. 2 weeks later, the photographer sent me the group shots for approval. I was scrolling through them when one picture made my stomach drop. It was a photo of the junior class. Everyone was smiling except for one figure in the back row. She wasn't on any roster. No one remembered her. Her face was pale, her hair too dark, and her eyes, wide, almost gray, looked right at the camera. The strange part was the way her outline blurred slightly, like she was caught between the flash and something else. I showed it to another teacher. He went quiet and left the room. Later that day, the photographer called to ask if we were playing a joke on him. He said when he tried to edit the picture, his software froze, and when he reopened it, the girl's face had moved closer to the front row. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that photograph. The next morning, it was gone from my desk. No one knew where it went, and I didn't want to press the issue. October came, and with it, the football game schedules and pep rallies. The kids loved telling the story of the extra face. They said the girl's name was Elena or Ella or something close. The legend was that she was a student who'd gone missing in the 1930s, last seen walking toward the school one stormy night. Some said she slipped down the old stairwell that led to the tunnels. Others whispered she'd jumped from the balcony of the auditorium after finding out her brother had died overseas. Every version ended the same way, her face showing up in the yearbook photo of whichever class had forgotten to leave a seat open during the picture. One evening, after grading late again, I walked past the auditorium. The doors were cracked open. I don't know why I stopped. Inside, the seats glowed faintly under the moonlight that slipped through the upper windows. It was silent except for the low hum of the city outside. Then I heard it, a girl's voice, soft and distant like someone humming to herself. The sound came from the stage. I stepped inside. The air felt heavier, thick with that dry, old smell of velvet and dust. My shoes clicked on the wooden floor as I moved toward the front. The curtain was drawn halfway, and behind it I could see a figure standing still. A girl, maybe 16, wearing an old-fashioned dress that looked like it belonged in a black and white photo. Her back was to me. "Hello," I said. She didn't move. I took another step. The hum stopped. Slowly, she turned her head, not her body, just her head, and the air seemed to go colder all at once. Her face wasn't angry or sad. It was blank, almost curious, like she was studying me. Her eyes caught the faint light, reflecting it like glass. Then she smiled, and the sound that came next wasn't a scream but a sharp, choking gasp that seemed to come from all around the room. The curtain dropped. I ran. I didn't stop until I was outside in the parking lot, bent over and shaking. Behind me, the auditorium windows were dark again, the reflection of the city lights flickering in the glass. The next morning I tried to tell the principal. He listened politely and said the auditorium had no electricity at night. The breakers were turned off to save power. He said it must have been the wind. I didn't argue. A few weeks later, yearbook proofs came in again. Another class photo, another familiar shape in the back, the same pale face, now clearer, smiling faintly. No one questioned it anymore. Some of the students even started to leave a space in every group photo just to be safe. I left El Paso High at the end of that semester. I told them I was moving closer to family, but the truth is I couldn't take that feeling anymore. The way the walls seemed to listen, the way the hallways stretched longer at night. Sometimes I dream about that school. In the dream, I'm walking down the same corridor, hearing those footsteps behind me, always just out of sight. And when I look into the windows, I don't see my reflection anymore. It's her, always her, watching, waiting for another photo. The Devil's Backbone cuts across the hill country like a scar carved by God himself. A long ridge of pale limestone rising above the mesquite and live oak, shimmering in the Texas heat by day and whispering in the dark by night. Folks around Blanco and Wimberley will tell you it's cursed ground. They'll say that soldiers from both sides of the Civil War, Comanche warriors, and long-dead settlers still wander there. Their unfinished stories carried on the wind that moans through the rocks. Most brush it off as old cowboy talk. I used to too, until I saw what moves out there after dark. It started when I took a job hauling construction supplies between San Marcos and Junction. The route cut across the Devil's Backbone, and most drivers avoided it after sundown. I didn't. I liked the quiet, the way the stars came out sharp and close in the Texas night, the soft hum of the tires on the asphalt. But there was something uneasy about that stretch, something that made the air heavier as you climbed the ridge, as if time itself thickened. The first time I felt it, it was near a turn where the guardrail was torn and twisted from an old wreck. My headlights caught the shape of a man standing just off the road. He was tall, shoulders squared, dressed in a long coat that looked more like gray homespun than anything modern. He didn't move, didn't even seem to breathe. I slowed, thinking maybe it was a stranded motorist, but when I pulled alongside, there was nothing there. Just the cedar trees rustling softly. After that, I started noticing things. A faint smell of gunpowder when the wind shifted. The low clop of horses' hooves echoing somewhere off the ridge when I knew there was no horse for miles. Sometimes when I stopped to rest, I'd hear a man's voice behind me, low, weary, like someone murmuring orders. Once, I turned around quick enough to catch a flicker of something in the dark, a faint gray shimmer that bent the starlight before vanishing. I told myself it was exhaustion, tricks of light. But one night late in August, everything changed. There had been a thunderstorm earlier that day, and the air was thick with the smell of wet limestone and cedar. The mist hung low across the ridge, rolling and curling around the mesquite like smoke. My radio had gone static halfway up, and the cell signal was gone, which wasn't unusual out there. I was alone, crawling up the grade, wipers squeaking against the windshield, when I saw the lantern. It swung faintly ahead of me, just off the shoulder, a warm yellow glow bobbing as if someone were walking. I slowed the truck and leaned out the window. The beam cut through the mist, showing nothing but brush and rock. Then I saw him. A man in a slouch hat, his clothes soaked, his face half hidden by the shadow of the brim. He held the lantern high, waving it back and forth like he was signaling me to stop. I pulled to the side and rolled down the window. "You all right, buddy?" I called. The figure didn't answer, only pointed down the slope toward a cluster of oaks. I hesitated, but something in his gesture, urgent, desperate, made me climb out. The rain had started again, soft but steady. The beam of my flashlight cut through it in thin slices. I followed where the man had pointed, stepping over slick rocks, the mud pulling at my boots. The air was strange, too quiet. Even the crickets had gone still. Then I saw the outline of something large and sunken in the earth ahead. It was a wagon, or what was left of one, half buried in the limestone, its wheels rotted to black rings, the iron rims half swallowed by the soil. Beside it lay bones, dozens of them, bleached and tangled, the remains of men, horses, and something else I couldn't place. I felt the hair rise on the back of my neck. The bones weren't old in the way you'd expect. They were clean, as if picked fresh. A voice came from behind me. "We never made it to Blanco." I spun around, and there he was, the man with the lantern, standing just a few feet away. The flame didn't flicker in the wind. His face was pale, streaked with mud or ash, his eyes hollow and gray. "They took us on this road," he said, "and they left us where the rocks drink the blood." I stumbled backward, tripping over a root, but when I looked again, he was gone. The lantern had dropped, but the light didn't go out. It stayed burning in the mud. I didn't wait. I ran back to the truck, slammed the door, and drove until I hit the highway, shaking so hard I could barely hold the wheel. When I finally stopped at a diner outside of Blanco, I told the waitress what I'd seen. She didn't laugh or look surprised. She just nodded slowly and said, "You met the backbone." Then she told me what her grandfather used to say, that the ridge was cursed long before any war, before Texas was even a name. The limestone there was ancient, full of trapped spirits, echoes of people who'd died hard. Comanche warriors, settlers, soldiers, they all bled into the same rock, and sometimes the rock gives them back. I tried not to think about it, but every time I took that route afterward, something followed me. A figure in the fog, a handprint on the windshield. Once in the mirror, I saw faces pressed against the back window of my cab, gray, silent, watching. They vanished before I could blink. I quit that job after 3 months. The last night I drove the backbone, I pulled over one final time right where I'd first seen the lantern. The air was dry, the stars clear and sharp. I stepped out, meaning to say goodbye to whatever haunted that ridge. That's when I heard it, the faint roll of a drum, deep and slow, coming from the limestone itself. Then a woman's voice singing in a language I didn't know. It was soft, mournful, carried on the wind. I saw shadows moving between the trees, men in uniforms, their outlines flickering like smoke, their faces lit from below by a light that wasn't from this world. They marched in silence, heading toward the valley, their eyes empty. I climbed back into my truck and didn't look back. But I'll tell you this. Sometimes when the night's quiet and the wind's right, you can still smell the cedar and gunpowder, still hear the footsteps on the ridge. And if you ever drive that road alone, keep your eyes on the yellow line and don't stop for lanterns, because on the devil's backbone, the dead don't rest, they just keep walking, waiting for someone to follow them home. Late one evening in Granbury, the rain came down in slow, steady sheets that glistened under the street lamps along Pearl Street. The town was quiet except for the hum of tires on wet pavement and the faint strains of a piano leaking from somewhere down the block. I was in town to write an article about Texas ghost stories for a small historical magazine, and every local I'd spoken to had mentioned the same place with a mixture of amusement and unease, the Granbury Opera House. They said the ghost of John Wilkes Booth still haunted it, hiding behind a false name, rehearsing scenes from plays he'd never finish. At first I thought it was just another piece of small-town folklore, but by the time I stood across the street from the old limestone building, something about it didn't feel like a story anymore. The building's facade gleamed faintly beneath the streetlights, its tall arched windows black as polished mirrors, its wooden doors shut tight. Yet from behind them came the sound of applause, soft and distant, like 100 hands clapping inside a sealed room. The curator who'd agreed to meet me was named Helen Pruitt, a middle-aged woman with silver hair tied into a bun, and the kind of posture that came from years of managing theater productions. She met me at the entrance holding a brass key and an umbrella. "You're late," she said in a tone that was half scold, half concern. "But you picked a good night for it. He's more active when it rains." Inside, the air smelled of dust, velvet, and wood polish. The lobby looked frozen in time. Marble floors, a chandelier with half its bulbs burnt out, and posters advertising long-forgotten performances. Helen led me down the aisle of the main theater, her footsteps muffled by the red carpet. The stage curtains were drawn, and the only light came from a few dim sconces on the walls. "The Opera House was built in 1886, she said. "Restored in the 70s. And if you believe the stories, Booth was living under the name John St. Helen right here in Granbury. Before he died, they say he confessed everything on his deathbed. We get people every week coming in to feel the energy, or talk to him. Most just take selfies and leave disappointed." I asked if she believed it. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she led me onto the stage. The old boards creaked under our weight. "I don't know what I believe," she said softly, "but I've seen the curtains move when there's no draft. I've heard humming in the dressing rooms, and one night I found cigar ashes on the balcony. We don't allow smoking anywhere in the building." The air felt heavier on the stage, thick with the smell of age and damp wood. Helen excused herself to fetch the maintenance log for me, leaving me alone under the dim glow of the footlights. I stood there listening. At first it was just the whisper of rain on the roof. Then something else. A low murmur like someone reciting lines. The sound came from backstage, faint but distinct. A man's voice carrying a rhythm that reminded me of Shakespeare. I called out thinking Helen had returned, but the voice stopped. I felt an irrational urge to follow it, so I stepped off the stage and pushed through the heavy curtains into the wings. Back there the air was colder. Dust motes hung in the beam of my flashlight, swirling like smoke. Old props and costumes lined the walls, trunks of fake swords, wigs, and rolled backdrops. One of the dressing room doors was slightly open. A sliver of light spilled through the crack, flickering like candlelight. I knocked once, no answer. When I pushed it open, the first thing I saw was a reflection in the mirror. A man sitting in front of it, dressed in a dark suit, shoulders hunched, face pale in the glass. His eyes met mine in the reflection before I even realized there was no one sitting there at all. The chair was empty. The light flickered and died. I backed out, breathing hard, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the light. I'd seen reflections in old glass that could play strange games, especially with moving flashlights. But something else caught my attention. The faint smell of cigar smoke. It hung thick in the air, curling toward the ceiling. Then came footsteps from the stage above, measured, deliberate, like someone pacing. I stepped quietly to the edge of the curtains and peered out. The house was dark, the seats empty. But on stage, the curtain had lifted slightly, and a single spotlight glowed at center stage. It wasn't on before. In that circle of light stood a shadowed figure, its outline sharp and human, wearing what looked like an old theater costume. Long coat, high collar. He was holding something, a script or maybe a letter, and reciting words in a voice so low I could barely make them out. Every syllable was crisp, deliberate, haunted. When he finished, he turned his head slightly, and I caught the gleam of eyes beneath the brim of his hat. Then the light went out again. Helen found me minutes later standing frozen by the curtain. I told her what I'd seen, expecting her to laugh, but instead her face drained of color. "You heard him," she said quietly. "That's his cue speech. He only does it once every few months." She looked toward the stage, then at me. "Don't talk to him. Don't try to make him notice you. He doesn't like being reminded that he's dead." I stayed with her for another hour as the storm outside thickened. We walked through the narrow upper corridors behind the balcony, where the wood smelled of rot and varnish. She told me about past sightings, stagehands who heard humming, actors who refused to rehearse after dark. A custodian who quit after a man in old-fashioned clothes followed him to the door and vanished when the lights came on. I took notes, trying to sound detached, but the longer we stayed, the more the atmosphere pressed against me. Every hallway seemed too long, every shadow too deep. When she finally locked up, I thanked her and headed back to my car, parked beside the courthouse square. But as I reached for the door handle, I glanced up at the Opera House. The top-floor window glowed faintly from within, A silhouette stood there perfectly still, watching. The hat, the high collar, unmistakable even from the street. The figure raised one hand in what looked like a slow, deliberate bow before the light blinked out. I didn't go back inside. Not that night. I returned to Fort Worth the next morning and wrote the article. I tried to keep it rational, focused on the history and folklore, but I couldn't stop thinking about that shadow on the stage. The more I read about Booth's supposed escape and the alias John St. Helen, the stranger it seemed. There were letters, journal fragments, even a photograph from Granbury dated 1879 that looked eerily like him. Most historians dismissed it as myth, but one account in an old county record mentioned an actor renting a room behind the opera house, spending his nights practicing monologues from Macbeth. He died suddenly one winter evening. The name on the lease was smudged, but part of it, just the letters Saint He, remained legible. A week later, Helen called. Her voice trembled slightly. "You remember the spotlight that came on by itself?" she asked. "We checked the circuit box. It's not wired anymore. Hasn't been since the renovation. That whole row of lights hasn't worked in years." She paused. "And we found ashes again. Same spot on the balcony. That night I couldn't sleep. The rain had returned, pattering against the windows. Around midnight I went to my desk to review my recordings from Granbury. I hadn't planned to, but something compelled me. On one clip, just after Helen leaves me alone on stage, I heard it again. The faint murmur of a voice, but this time it was clearer. A man reciting words that didn't belong to any play I knew. "The curtain falls," he said softly, "but the performance never ends." Then a quiet chuckle, and in the background, unmistakably, the sound of applause. On maps, Camp Ford is just a fenced hillside north of Tyler, where the city thins into pine and red dirt. But if you stand there long enough after sundown, the place stops being a dot on a brochure and turns into a room with no walls. The largest Confederate prison in Texas. At night, the mist curls like smoke, and you can hear the roll call of men who never got released. I read that exact wording off a laminated sign somebody zip-tied to the chain link near the parking lot. It was meant as a hook for tourists, a tidy way to step past the blood and boredom of a prison camp and into a story you could share over barbecue later. It stuck under my skin the way certain slogans do when they've got a piece of the truth in them. I told myself I was there to work, to pull details for a freelance piece a friend at the paper wanted for the fall guide, ghost tours and living history hours and where to park your minivan, while your kids ask if soldiers slept standing up. I had a recorder in my pocket, an old Nikon around my neck, and a cold bottle of gas station coffee sweating into my hand. Tyler was the city where my mother grew up and my grandfather died, and where the stoplights always felt a little longer. I had the site to myself except for a pickup squatting by the far end of the fence and a caretaker's, shed with a porch light that made a yellow cone on the leaves. The man in the pickup was an old volunteer named Hatch who wore a cap with the camp's logo and had a catfish tattoo that finished under his shirt sleeve. He ambled over when he saw me reading the sign and said without introduction, "You came to listen or to look?" I said both. He chewed on that. Then he told me to stick to the interpretive trail and not to wander past the low ridges where the ditch traces are, because the ground gets spongy after rain, and snakes like the shade there. He kept his eyes on the trees while he talked, like he was waiting for someone to step out. When I asked about the roll call, he shook his head the way people do when they know a story's about to claim space. "That's not for the paper," he said. "That's for the ones who stand quiet." Then he climbed back into his pickup and shut the door with a careful hand. It was late October. Tyler had moved into that sweet week where heat finally loosens its collar. The pines breathed out a cool resin smell, and the grass went to whispers at my ankles. I walked past the wooden signs they'd mounted on tall posts. Stockade here, hospital yard there, spring branch and a line of damp leaves, and the earthworks traced like old lips around the clearing. If you want to understand a place, follow the water. The camp spring still ran thin and steady, and the mosquitoes around it kept their own hungry vigil. I set my recorder on a post and let it roll while I took photos of the mounded earth and the way the light folded itself between the trees. I said out loud what I saw because that was how I organized things. Fence shadows like crosshatching, pine needles nested against the old trench, squirrels going through the motions of their job like any of us. I had a name in my notebook that did not belong to me and did. Elijah Brandt. My grandfather said we had a Brandt who wandered south and never wrote again. He told stories about a faded photo that went missing and a letter with a brown stamp that read "Held at Tyler." None of this would have mattered if the paper hadn't asked for a human angle for their little ghost tour spread. Readers like to hear about a single face better than 100, so I went to the Smith County Historical Society and scrolled through a database and found an Elijah Brandt out of a Wisconsin regiment who'd been captured near Mansfield, shipped like freight and set down here in a pen of pine and heat. He survived. The notice said so. Paroled and exchanged months later. My grandfather had it wrong the way family stories often go. Elijah went home. So I came to the camp with the idea that the ghost angle was exactly that. But a man like Elijah might stand in for the rest and give the readers something to hang on. It made the job feel cleaner than it was. Dusk at Camp Ford runs in slow folds. The light took its time leaving and every sound stretched out like a yawning dog. Behind me, the highway padded away and the wind settled into the needles. A whip-poor-will set up shop somewhere by the ravine. I watched the breath of the place thin into something like fog, though it wasn't cold enough for breath at all. I picked up the recorder, said the exact words from the sign to have them on tape, and that was when I heard it. Soft and clipped and in a cadence that was not modern. Brandt. Some sounds the body knows before the mind gets there. The hair on my forearms lifted. I looked at the path to my left, the path to my right, and then at the fence where the caretaker's shed light burned through the trees in a honey triangle. There was no one. I told myself it was a ranger calling to a kid or a runner with earbuds singing along to a song and I had misheard. I clicked the recorder on again, felt the red light bloom under my thumb and raised it like you could point a device at a sound and pin it. Then the next one came like the last, tender and exact, as if it had been practiced so many evenings that the words had worn grooves. Cabot. To hear. The hear came from nowhere and everywhere. The way a porch chime speaks with the whole house. I should have turned toward my car. I should have waved at the caretaker and asked him to tell me his version of the story. Instead, I listened, because that's what I had told myself I came to do, and the air complied, and the slow page of names turned in a voice that kept itself even. The names belonged to the north and to places far away from the pine. Some of them came with the word here, and some did not, and after a stretch, I realized that every third or fourth call came with a second voice answering with a lag, like a man jerked awake and wanting to prove he had not been asleep. And almost every time the answer was a hair quieter than the one before it. The mist had the color of creek water and moved like breath written over frost. I asked the recorder to make sense of it. My own voice sounded thin and foolish. If this is a trick, it's a good one. If this is wind, it's got opinions. I stood my ground until a branch cracked behind me, and I turned so fast my camera strap snapped against my collarbone. That was just a deer in the brush, torn between fight or skip away. I went back to the car with my heart marching in place. When I listened to the audio that night at the rental, the background hiss of the park stood like a wall. I boosted what I could and lined the waveforms up. I could hear my voice reading the brochure line. I could hear the whip-poor-will. I could hear my breath. What I could not hear, not the way I had heard it in the clearing, were the names. I slept badly with the recorder on the table beside me, and dreamed that the ceiling fan was a wheel turned by a long rope that disappeared under the bed, and that someone I could not see pulled that rope every time I closed my eyes, urging the day forward inch by inch while my body was kept politely in place. I went back the next night, and the next because the story had gone from article to itch, and then to debt. On the second night, a woman with a stroller walked the trail and waved at me with 2 fingers. On the third, a high school couple came to take moody photos on the earthworks and left giggling and spooked. Hatch watched me with a patient frown and asked once if I had a church. I told him my church was a blank page with a deadline. He said a blank page would eat you and you'd thank it for the privilege. The voices did not perform on command. When they came spare, just 2 or 3 names every hour, and then on the 4th night a run of them thick as rain for minutes that stacked into a wall, and then leaned on me. I recognized the pause between the call and the answer, and the stubborn order to it no matter the weather. Some nights were dead as paper. Some nights the place woke its full height and stood with its back straight. I learned the shape of the stockade in my feet. The path made a rectangle, and the rectangle made a map, and the map made a prison in my head that had nothing to do with fences and everything to do with inches. I started speaking to Elijah when the names fell quiet, not because I believed he was there, but because the story I had told myself would not sit still. I told him about Loop 323 and about the rose garden where my mother worked one summer, and how the smell of roses could rot if you stood downwind of a truck too long. I told him about the coffee at the gas station and about school buses that still had the same folded seats they had when I was a kid. I told him about the call that had followed me into the rental house and the way my recordings held everything, except the part that mattered. I was foolish enough to thank him for making it happen, because I needed a witness either way. On the fifth night, rain came thin and steady and made the pines stand in their uniforms. I hiked the trail with a plastic poncho kicking at my knees and stood by the old spring branch that looked like a wrinkle in the earth. I saw, half buried in the mud where the water had chewed at the bank, a circular bit of metal the size of a $50. I knelt with my hand in the cold and wiggled it free. It was pitted and black, stamped with letters that had been worried at by time, and the back held 2 punctures where something had once threaded it. I took a photo with my phone, wiped it against my shirt, and made out Brant scratched rough and shallow into the metal. For a moment the rain forgot about me and I forgot about breathing. There were artisans who made replica tags for the gift shop. There were kids who threw fake coins in the mud for fun. There were 100 reasons to doubt what my palm said it knew. I took it to the caretaker's shed and waited under his tin roof until he came out with a towel. Hatch held the disc like it might bite. He nodded once, which said he had seen one before, and said, "Men marked themselves any way they could. They wanted to be found." He handed it back to me. "Keep your head about you." Then he said something that put the smallest crack in my certainty. He said, "You can leave gifts. You cannot take them." I put the disc back where I found it and watched the water lick it. And I walked the trail in the rain like a man ruining his shoes with purpose. And then I stood where I knew the middle of the stockade had been, and heard the call not as sound but as a pressure change, air opening around a word before the word comes. The voice did not need the ears to be ears. It said Brant, and the hear that answered was my own voice with the floor tilted under it. Names can be ropes or knives. This one tugged me forward a step. I pictured the rectangle around me and saw the pen stand up on top of the present, like a double exposure. Saw the pine logs notched and blackened with use. Saw weathered men holding their bodies like rented rooms. Saw guards in butternut doing their job poorly and well. Saw water carried in tin pails. Saw cards on a blanket. Saw a piece of leather being chewed for flavor. Saw the way a man stands when he is counting. There are nights when the past is just a museum of gestures. There are nights when it is the only room available. I said I was here. I said it with the careful courtesy you use when answering a stranger's call. I do not know why I said it or why the shape the word made felt like the shape my mouth was supposed to hold. The answer filled space and then slipped away. The roll kept moving. Names like stones across a stream. Water over them. Then a scrape in the brush took the scene back for itself, and a raccoon hustled across the path with a pale length of bread in its mouth, like it had robbed somebody's picnic in town, and fled here to eat in peace. My heart rattled against the bars of my ribs and I laughed, because I was cold and ridiculous, and the human animal will try anything to unmake a moment when it knows it has been seen. I played the recorder back in the car with the heater on and rain pegging the roof. This time the audio carried something like a man speaking from another room, a hum more than a voice. When I dragged a cursor across it, the hum lifted at the points where a name should be. And when I leaned close to the tinny speakers, I could hear a shape. I sat in that car until Hatch tapped the glass with his knuckle and told me to go home. The story the paper wanted vanished under the one the place was telling me. And I let that happen, because some stories are like that. I told myself I would come one last evening and gather the facts like a bucket gathers rain. I would file something tidy that the editor could slot between apple orchards and pumpkin patches. One last evening sounds larger than it is when you tell it to yourself. The last evening was a Friday. The traffic wore itself thin as the sky fell blue to gray, and a wind started up that made the pines rub their hands together. Someone somewhere grilled meat and the smell came in a soft wet wave and then thinned out. I walked the rectangle and I left my phone in my pocket and the recorder off. I did not bring bread to break with ghosts. I brought only my mouth and the breath in it. They began when I came to the spring. Not the way before, sporadic mischief or sorrow, but in a full run of names like a ledger finding its place. I could hear the rhythm of a man who had called these before and before that, and the cracked pride in keeping his set, and the stubborn pleasure in order for order's sake. The answers came strong, then faint, then strong again like they were battling through weather. The mist rose in clean twist that made the earth look like it was cooling. I did not see anyone. I did not see anything. I saw the pine roots in the trench and the low light of the caretaker's porch and the path where my shoes had packed the dirt. I listened through all of it. When my name came, it was not Elijah. It was mine. First, then last, then the way my mother used to say it when she wanted me to mind. The mouth that said it was not my mother's. It belonged to the one who counted. I replied without pause, because you answer to your name even when you do not want to, and my hair rode the air like a small bird making for a branch. The roll moved on. The list reached the end. The voice marked the page in that silent way women mark novels when they are interrupted. A finger pressed over the line. Then the voice said, "Released none." The air around me drew in like a held breath. Something in my chest argued. Men were exchanged, I wanted to say. Men left this place and fought again and went home or did not. The voice announced the absence of release the way a weatherman announces a drizzle. It was a condition, not a wish. I stepped back toward my car and found without looking the new line that had been laid just for me. It was not in the dirt. It was in the skin, a seam I could feel when I turned in a certain direction, the way you know when a road slopes toward a ditch even if the blacktop looks flat. I walked out of the rectangle and past the sign and into the present, and for a moment it felt like slipping a ring off and then realizing the finger remembers the circle. I thought about Hatch's rule on gifts. I thought about the disc in the mud with my family set into it like a commandment. I thought about the blank page that wanted me whole. That night at the rental, the ceiling fan did not move and the dark had a grain to it like old wood. I could hear a list being read in the quiet between cars on the street. Not words, but the action of them. The roll of numbers in a head. When I shifted, the bed answered with a tired spring. I slept in the shallow water that comes before morning and dreamed of a gate built of pine poles and a sign. Over it stamped with letters that were not of this place and not of any place, and yet I could read them the way you read your own name face down. I filed the article on Sunday. It said the things an article can say. It mentioned interpretive trails and careful reconstruction, and the museum downtown where a docent will tell you the same story, 3 different ways if you ask. It mentioned the feeling of quiet that sits on a place when people have been kept there against their will. Paragraph after paragraph clearing its throat and looking away. When my friend called to say the piece fit, that it would run on Tuesday, that I had done a nicer job than he expected, I said thanks and listened past him to the humid air in my own kitchen and the way it held still, like a listener deciding whether to nod. I left Tyler, because leaving is a skill my family learned young, and I drove north with the windows down and the radio off, because it felt right to let the road talk. Outside Mount Pleasant, a train matched me for a while and then pulled ahead like a big, easy animal. I stopped for lunch at a place that sold good pie. I watched a ball game on a silent television with captions that lagged. I told myself the feeling would thin as miles stacked under the tires. It did not. It went with me as far as the county line and then beyond. That night in a motel near the state border, I woke to my name pronounced with care and I said, "Here because that is the bargain and the body keeps it." The disc stayed where I put it. The spring kept running. The cedar posts kept their neat angles. The caretakers swept pine straw back from the interpretive signs and replaced the laminated slogans when they weathered. School groups came and wriggled and left. The roll continued its work. At night the mist curled like smoke. On careful evenings when the air has the right weight and the place is more itself than it can afford in daylight, you may hear a name you think you know and an answer you could swear was your own. Some people will tell you a prison is always this. Some will tell you it is the echo of a man counting who never reached the end. I will tell you to keep your head and your feet and to remember what the voice said that last evening. Released none. In the dark, even the facts agree. The numbers line up. The men, so thin we confuse them for weather, take their places. We who believe ourselves to be spectators are only the latest to stand at attention when called. And when the list requires you, you will answer. You will do it kindly. Almost without your knowledge, the way a good guest opens his mouth to say grace when the table has gone quiet. The way a soldier marks his place in a line that has forgotten to end. The first time I put my hand on the door of the old Lavaca County Jail, the metal felt cool in a way that didn't belong to September. The courthouse square across the street held its afternoon heat like a skillet, and the oak leaves were still full of cicada hum, But the jail kept its own season inside, a winter that smelled of iron and old soap and a trace of something medicinal. The door latch pulled and stuck, then released with a lazy scrape, and I stepped into a place built to keep people, and everything they were, from moving. I had been hired by the county to help document the building ahead of a small museum project. The funding was a patchwork of grants, barbecue fundraisers, and one generous donation from a sheener man who had made good at the brewery and wanted this thing saved. I'd done historic sites before, painted churches and clapboard schools that still shone like a polish on the past. But this was different. This was a box that had stored nights. I had a camera, a notebook, a handheld recorder from my reporting days, and a habit of talking to empty rooms so I wouldn't feel rude. Hallettsville sits in the gentle fold of ranch land and river bottoms, a little town with Czech bakeries tucked into side streets and the smell of smoked meat rolling out of backyard pits on Saturdays. People wave from pickups on 90A and stop short at four-way flashes where no one is in a hurry. When I told folks what I was working on, most nodded and asked if I had heard anything in there yet. Like the jail was a radio you had to tune by bone. Steel bars still echo with fists from the other side, they said. The gallows creak even when no one's swinging. They said it the way you comment on bluebonnets. A known thing, a season you either catch or miss. Inside, the ground floor was a tight grid of rooms, some for booking and records, some for the sheriff back when the job came with a cot and a stove. The office still had a wooden desk with a burn mark at the corner that looked like a boot heel, had pressed a cigarette out with more anger than necessary. There was a wall of beige file cabinets where somebody had labeled drawers with black marker letters that were a little too cheerful for their purpose. Upstairs were the cell blocks, 2 long aisles of barred doors, each door with a little squinting hatch, each cell containing a bunk and the remains of a galvanized bucket that once had a lid. I walked through on that first day and felt the building do what old buildings do when an unfamiliar person crosses their threshold. It gave a little, like a dog deciding whether you were the kind of stranger that brought biscuits or trouble. I took photos of hinges and bolts. My recorder picked up the clank of my steps and the hollow sound of my voice when I told the empty hallway that I would only be a few hours. On my way out, I put my hand to the door again and felt the same cool as before, as if the metal had never been touched by day. That night, back at the motel between the Dairy Queen and the feed store, I listened to my audio. There was my voice, steady as I could make it, talking about dimensions and light angles and the way the floor sloped a hair toward the back wall. Then came a faint tapping. At first I thought it was road noise caught by the recorder, the rumble of a cattle trailer or a pickup with loose lug nuts. But the tapping had a pattern. It was not fast like a loose sign flapping. It was deliberate. 5 taps, then 2, then 5 again. The kind of rhythm that wants to be remembered. A code you almost know because your marrow knows how to count. I didn't sleep much. Morning came with coffee at the counter at Country Bakery, where the woman behind the register asked if I wanted a poppy seed colac and told me to try the prune if I wanted the taste of her grandmother's kitchen. I ate slow and watched local teenagers in Letterman jackets queue up for pig in a blankets, and the normalcy of everything pressed my shoulders down in a good way. By the time I reached the jail at 9, the sun had cooked the air enough that even the pigeons on the courthouse cornice had taken to the shade. The jail's upstairs corridor felt wrong that second day, a hair colder than the day before. Like a draft stood still and waited for me. When I stepped into the east block, the smell of metal took on a wet edge, the kind of scent you notice when a storm is working up in the distance, even if the sky over you is blue. I checked my watch, clicked on the recorder, and set it on the floor outside the first cell. The first real sound I heard wasn't tapping at all, but a scrape. It came from the far end of the block, a sound like a chair's foot dragging on old boards. The cells had no chairs. I walked toward it, and every door I passed reflected me in thin gray slices. My sneakers made a soft, rubbery squeak that I wished would hush. At the last cell, I put my hand against the bars and leaned in. Light from the narrow window painted the cement in a door shape. There were marks in the paint on the wall. Not words, not drawings. Short vertical dashes, grouped by 5s. I've seen the same on shop walls. Next to some mechanic's workbench, the asterisked Bible of Days. This, it seemed, was a small book of time served. I reached through the bars and touched one of the marks. A tiny flake broke and clung to my finger, gray as ash. My hand shook and I made myself be still. "It's paint," I said out loud, "just paint." My voice came back to me with a little bounce, a too cheerful echo, like I was doing a rehearsal version of myself for a crowd that didn't trust the rousing lines. On my third day, an older man named Kukurek met me at the door with a set of keys the county kept in a red firebox at the courthouse. He had that rancher's leanness that comes from long days outside and the kind of stare that weighs you without making you feel judged. He told me his granddaddy had been sheriff when the jail was still working. They used to call the prisoners by their first names because that's what folks did then. He thumped the keys into my palm and asked me not to stay too late. That winter feeling inside, he said, gets stronger after sundown. I asked him about the gallows. He nodded toward the back. We walked down a corridor and through a door that stuck halfway and then gave, as if it had once been habitually shoved by a shoulder that knew exactly how hard to lean. The gallows was not the cinematic thing you see in movies. It was a clean-angled platform with a beam above, bare of rope, the wood varnished and professionally simple. The county had used it sparingly, he said, and the last time had been before his time, but his granddaddy didn't like the way the sound of that beam got into a man's head. He said you could stand out here on a dry day and hear it creak like a tree in a high wind when there wasn't a breath moving. He said the sound had weight. He would be at the square if I needed him, drinking coffee with the men who solved nothing and saved the world once a morning. When he left, the yard was quieter. There was a cat on the far wall slipping through sun, and a dragonfly that kept cutting a figure 8, never quite leaving. I stood beneath the beam and listened hard until I felt absurd, like someone holding their breath to make themselves hear their pulse. The creak came on its own schedule. One long run as if a heavy hinge were adjusting to a new day, then a rest. Then a shorter sigh, wood talking to wood, like a door someone doesn't close because they are worried they won't be able to open it again. I set the recorder on the platform, then placed my palm against the beam. It was the same chill as the door. A coolness that was not a temperature so much as an idea. The way a church feels when you step into it alone at noon. Every nailhead in that beam had a little halo of darker wood around it. Where a ring had once hung, there was an iron stain eaten into the grain like a shadow that refused to wash away. Work kept me at the jail most days for 2 weeks. I took measurements and made to-scale drawings with the steadiness of a man trying not to think. At night I listened. The tapping came in different sequences, never frantic. Sometimes it was 5 and 2, sometimes it was 3 and 3 and 1. The creak in the yard always appeared on playback louder than my memory of it. In the recordings, it sounded near and personal, as if the beam were bending toward the microphone to whisper one end of a bargain. On a Friday afternoon, a storm brewed over the county line, the kind of smudged charcoal thunderhead that roams the prairie late in the day when the heat refuses to quit. The air went to that straw-colored haze that makes you nervous without telling you why. I decided to close up early, but habits beat fear most days, and I took one last set of stills on the second floor. While I was at it, the lights flickered. The work lights we had strung from outlets in the hall went dim for a heartbeat, and then burned steady again. The old fixtures bolted along the ceiling did not come on, of course, but I wouldn't have expected that. Electricity in these places feels like a courtesy, not a right. When I stepped into the east block, the first door on the left stood ajar. I had not unlocked it. I know because the keys swing heavy and honest when I use them, and nothing in this building moves without telling you. I approached the door and laid my palm flat against it. The steel was cold and damp, as if a small cloud had taken up residence in there. Part of me wanted to push it shut and lock it. The other part stood very still and listened to the storm roll over. That still part had a feeling a dog gets when the mailman's footfalls change. You don't know why you know it, but you know it. The tapping began again, soft and methodical from somewhere down the row. 5 and 2, 5 and 2. Then a pause. Then 3, 3, 1. It took me longer than it should have to realize that it was not one tap, but 2 different kinds. One was the sharp clip of metal on metal, like a ring against a bar. The other had a duller tone, as if knuckles were calling from inside a pocket of air. When I finally moved, I moved too quickly. My shoulder brushed a door jamb. The sound stopped, like a person who has been overheard. "Who's there?" I said. Because that's what you say, even though you don't expect an answer you can put into a report. When I looked into the next open cell, I saw a book on the cot. It was far too modern to be part of the jail's old contents. A cheap ledger from the office supply store, pale green, with pages ruled for columns and numbers. It lay open to the middle, weighted flat with a chipped mug. On the visible page, a list of names marched in pencil down the left. To the right of each name there was a date, and under each date a time. I saw the handwriting and recognized it, the way you recognize your own voice on the phone when you didn't expect to hear it. The dates were all from this month. The last name on the list was mine. My head did a slow shrug of refusal. I touched the pencil resting in the spine and picked it up like it might bite. There it was, my full name, the date written in a sturdy, ordinary hand, and a time that had not yet happened. The storm rolled closer. Somewhere downstairs, a door shifted and tried to fit its frame better. I closed the ledger with my palm on the cover and felt the grooved softness where other palms had pressed. The mug wobbled but did not tip. The gallows creaked. The sound reached me inside the jail as clearly as if the beam had been above my head. It was followed by a faint squeal, as if something had turned on a pin that had not moved in years. I put the pencil back and moved to the corridor, every footstep remarkable, as if each one might be the last that was entirely under my control. At the top of the stairs, the hall was darker than it should have been. The sky had gone green and bruised in the windows. I went down, feeling for each tread with my foot like an old man who doesn't trust a board that has already broken once. In the front office, the air was cooler, the medicinal scent stronger. A clean that hides a stain rather than removes it. The storm scratched the windows with its first rain. I told myself I would lock up and ride it out at the motel. I told myself I had done enough for the day. The back corridor to the yard had pooled the gloom. The thunder hit then, a full unrolled rug of sound that made the shiny work lights shudder on their cords. I reached for the yard door and felt that same reluctant give, the door's particular way of asking if you knew the right pressure. I pushed through into the open and the rain took me in the face, big Texas drops fat as quarters. The beam above the platform wore a darker stripe now where the wet cut into old varnish. The cat had gone wherever cats go when the world gets too loud. The dragonfly was no longer interested in this place. I climbed the steps to the platform and stood under the beam and told myself nothing would happen. The yard smelled of wet dust and old wood. The recorder I had left on the edge glinted weakly. I pressed a hand to the beam again. The cool went up my arm and into my shoulder. I felt for the stain where the ring had been and found it easily, as if my hand were a key and the beam was a lock that had finally learned to be tired. A tiny vibration thrummed through the wood into my palm, too steady for wind, too deliberate for a building settling. The creak came again, very close, and then a sharp sound that was not the weather. It was the tiny ping of tension, like a cable tightened a notch. I took my hand away. Behind me, the yard door swung until it nearly closed and then hung there, the jam catching it like a referee's hand. The lights upstairs flickered again and held. I told myself to walk down the steps and leave. I told myself that the name in the ledger had been a mistake, a prank written by an intern I had never seen. I told myself a lot of things. What I did instead was turn and look up at the beam, like a man who wants to see his own reflection in old wood and know whether he is fogging the same mirror as the dead. The tapping began then, open and confident now, as if whoever had been hiding had decided there was no point. 5 and 2. Pause. 3 and 3 and 1. If it was a code, I didn't know the key. If it was a knock at a door, I was the door. Roll call, I said. The words came out of my mouth without permission, like a line in a play I had rehearsed years ago. Cold pressed into my throat and made the next word thin. Name, nothing, and then everything. The tapping ran down the line of cells in a wave, answering without voices. In the rain and the noise, I could hear it in the building. Second floor east block. A procession of knuckles and rings against bars. The kind of sound a dozen men might make at once if they had been waiting to be counted. The skin between my shoulder blades went tight. Not fear exactly, something more ancestral, the knowledge of a duty. I said my name without meaning to and knew as I did that I had it wrong. It came out in another arrangement, an older form, as if I were borrowing someone else's pronunciation. The creak answered like a judge taking notes he did not plan to read. The thunder passed for a moment and the rain softened. In the quiet, a voice reached me from the second floor. It was not a ghost voice full of reverb and cinema. It was a man's voice, tired and precise, with the flat vowels you hear in this part of Texas when somebody has spent a lot of years making himself understood to people who will misunderstand him anyway. He spoke my name as it was written in the ledger, letter by letter, and then the time. I took the steps down from the platform without running. In the office, the smell of medicinal soap was thick enough to taste. The hall light brightened and dimmed and brightened again. Rain on the windows had taken on that polite tone it uses when it knows it can stay all night. The front door held firm when I tried it, the latch refusing to release. I leaned my shoulder into it. Metal flexed and gave, and the door came open with a low sound like a sigh. On the courthouse square, the men under the awning watched the storm and pretended not to talk about it. I saw Kukurek among them, shoulders bowed under a denim jacket that had seen as much weather as any tree. I crossed the street, my shoes taking in water, and when I reached him I handed him the keys and a strange little laugh slipped out of me, the kind that sounds like someone trying to pull a fishbone from the back of his throat without making a scene. I told him I'd be back Monday. I told him I needed to check measurements. He took the keys and did not ask questions. Sometimes the older men in small towns show their kindness by refusing to know what you are telling them. At the motel, the AC kicked on with a groan and the room smelled like every motel room that has ever been mopped by a person who did their best with what they could afford. I set the recorder on the table and turned it on, and spoke my notes into it like a man leaving directions for a version of himself who might be confused by morning. The creak did not wait for me there. It came through the ceiling once, a soft flex, no more than the building breathing. I turned the recorder off and opened the closet to hang my shirt, because a small part of me wanted to make everything normal with the rituals of lonely travel. Inside the closet, there was a metal ring fixed to the ceiling beam. It was for hanging laundry rods, I told myself. It was for nothing at all. I shut the door gently. At 2 a.m, the tapping woke me. It came from the table from the recorder itself, the case clicking in a small contraction like an electronic cough. I lay there and counted. 5 and 2, pause, 3 and 3 and 1. I didn't turn on the light. I knew the room. I knew the shape of it and the absence of anything. Outside, a truck passed and its headlights slid across the blinds like the memory of a river. I found myself whispering names I had seen in files, names of farmhands and drifters, names of men who were somebody's sons even when they were nobody's pride. I said them the way a teacher says names at the start of a day. I said them the way a man at the foot of a platform says names before he tells those men to step into the square of a door they have only walked through once in their lives. By morning, the storm was gone and the sky had been washed fresh. In a town like Hallettsville, Sunday belongs to God and Monday belongs to men with lunch pails. I drove out to the jail and found Kokurek leaning against the front steps in the sun. He offered the keys and I didn't touch them. I asked him who keeps the records here. He nodded toward the courthouse. I told him I wanted to see the ledgers. He said I could see what I could, though many things had a way of not existing anymore when people got older or tired. In the records room, Ms. Dusek, who wore glasses that magnified her patience, brought me a box of booking logs and one wooden cigar box full of folded papers that smelled like the church attic. I opened the logs and moved through years like pages in a hymn book. In the cigar box, beneath a program for a 4th of July picnic, there was a slim book with pale green covers. It was the same cheap ledger. The spine had been stressed open to the middle. The pages were filled with names and dates and times, some in a hand I recognized, some not. The last entry was mine. Ms. Dusek raised a single eyebrow, the kind of courtesy itself, and said she would leave me to it. I stayed until the courthouse closed, and then I went back to the motel and sat with the recorder on the table and didn't press any buttons. I thought about how places keep their books. The painted churches count prayers by candle stubs. The battlefield at Goliad counts its dead by the way the air goes heavy at dawn. A high school in El Paso counts footsteps long after the last bell. Here the jail counted time and names and the creak of wood that had learned how to remember weight without showing it. None of it demanded anything. None of it had malice. It was the opposite. It was duty, the kind that can keep a place standing when the roof wants to give way. On Tuesday, I went back to work. I took my measurements and drew my drawings and said nothing to anyone about the ledger. I placed the recorder on the platform in the yard and stood under the beam and felt the cool gather around my wrist, the way a pond gathers around a hand in summer. The creak came and I did not flinch. The tapping came and I answered it with names, not to satisfy it, but to fulfill something. When I left, I took photographs of each cell and of the marks on the wall. I locked every door with unstinting care. The museum opened a year later. People walked through with children on their hips and told the children not to touch anything. Volunteers in matching shirts explained how justice used to look when it wore starched collars and hats with brims you could measure. In the far cell on the east block, the ledger sat under glass. The docents told a tidy story about record-keeping and lawmen's neat penmanship. Families drifted past and through and out into the sunlit yard where a wooden platform held the heat and gave off the faintest scent of varnish. Once in a while, on still afternoons, the gallows creaked. Just once, just enough to make a few heads turn as if they'd heard a summer oak give up a limb. I go back sometimes. I drift down from the square with a paper cup of coffee and stand in the yard and listen. I don't bring the recorder anymore. I don't need it. The sound is in me now the way a song you learned on a bad day lives in your throat. I don't touch the beam. I don't open the ledger. If I have visitors in town and they want a story, I tell them about the way the old jail keeps its own season. I tell them about steel that holds a coolness like a secret, and wood that knows duty the way some men wish they had known it. I tell them about a list of names that keeps growing, and a roll call that rises like mist and falls like rain. When they ask me what it all means, I say the only honest thing. I say it means the door is still there, and it opens from both sides, and somewhere a fist is still knocking, and I don't know whether it wants to be let out or let in.